Welcome members and additional members attending the Transport Committee today. Just for everyone, I'm just trying to get these lights changed because half the chamber's in darkness and half of us are being blinded, so hopefully that might be improved shortly. Let's first of all, Laura, can I have any apologies for absence, please?
We've received apologies from Assembly Member Eshlomi and from Assembly Member Bacon, Assembly Member Arbour and Assembly Member Cooper.
Lovely. Well, welcome Assembly Member Cooper and Assembly Member Arbour to today's meeting. And can I put on record from the Transport Committee our huge congratulations to Florence Eshlomi and Gareth Bacon for their election to Parliament. So really delighted for them both. It's a week of this. We did this at Budget yesterday. I think we'll be doing it at every meeting this week. Our main discussions today will be on the Elizabeth line, but let's just quickly go through any other business. I'm told always say social media if you want to use hashtag Assembly Transport, hashtag London Assembly. And make sure, please, everyone, including in the audience, can you put your phones on silent, please? And that is silent, not vibrate, because the microphones pick that up as well. Declarations of interest. Are there any other declarations? Can we note those in the report, members? Is that noted? Silence. This is going to be a hard meeting, I think. Thank you. Minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 9th of October as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you very much indeed. Summary list of actions. Can we note the summary list of actions outlined in the report?
Noted.
Brilliant. And then action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the actions taken under delegated authority? In particular, note the appointment of Emma Gibson as the new London Travel Watch Director.
Agreed.
Lovely, and we welcome her and look forward to meeting her in due course. Now let's move to our main item today, which is the an update and review of where we are with the Elizabeth line, Crossrail. We've got a fantastic panel before us today. I'm very lucky to be chairing this meeting today. So let's start from left to right. Mike Brown, the Transport Commissioner at TfL. Welcome, Mike. Heidi Alexander, the Deputy Mayor for Transport. Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Tony Meggs, who is the Chair of Crossrail, and Mark Wilde, who's the Chief Executive of Crossrail. Thank you all so much for coming along today, and we look forward to a really good discussion. I believe you wanted to do an update to start off with, is that correct?
Thank you, Chair. The lights that are blinding the Chair and Chief Executive Crossrail, I'm not sure if they're intentional or not.
Yes, it's a new technique we're trying.
That sort of oppression does work in relation to, I'm not sure the fruits of any evidence obtained, but they are quite bright. Chair, one of the important roles I think all people in position of power should face is scrutiny. One of the things that I did 6 months ago was to ask you if we could come back and give more information on Crossrail. Two members of the Assembly who do a brilliant job holding me to account and doing a good job for Londoners are Gareth Bacon and Florence Eshlomi. I think genuinely Parliament's gain will be the Assembly and Londoners' loss because they've done a brilliant job holding me to account, but also asking the tough questions that lead to us being better in the jobs we seek to do. And I'm sure we all echo your comments about our congratulations to both Gareth and Flo. From personal experience, I think they'll regret going to that place and leaving this place. But who am I to say? I'm sure Heidi would agree with that as well. Thank you, Chair. Look, the additional delay and further costs overrun of Crossrail has been very disappointing for all of us. I'm pleased we're able to attend today to provide further information and, as importantly, to answer any questions about the latest developments. As you know, on the 7th of November, Crossrail Limited confirmed that the central section of the route between Paddington and Abbey Wood would now open as soon as possible in 2021 rather than in late 2020. Additional funds of between £400 million and £650 million would be needed to complete the project, and that we and Londoners would be provided with further details early in the new year about when the Elizabeth line will open. The project team's view, as they approach the final stages of construction, is that they need more time to complete the testing of the trains and to manage the handover of the railway into customer service both safely and reliably. Despite these setbacks, it's clear that enormous progress is being made at Crossrail. Tony Meggs, Mark Wilde and the whole team now have a far better grip on the project. While responsibility for delivering sits with Crossrail Limited, I'm pleased with how open the new leadership team are being about the scale of the challenge and how the project is progressing. I've emphasised the need for regular and transparent reporting. I've personally attended 2 Crossrail board meetings, and Heidi, Mike, my Chief of Staff, David Bellamy, and I regularly meet with Tony and Mark as Chair and Chief Exec, who provide us with detailed project updates and share any emerging issues and risks. To be frank, this marks a welcome change from Crossrail's previous leadership team, who completely failed to understand and report what was actually happening with the project. Of course, I share the frustration of Londoners that the Elizabeth line is not yet open, and I apologise for this. But progress is being made. We've already achieved some very significant milestones over the last 6 months. This includes the start of multi-train testing, the successful handover of Victoria Dock and Pudding Mill Lane tunnel portals, and the completion of Stage 5A, allowing TfL rail services to operate between Paddington and Reading. Chair, I want to finish by saying this. This is an extraordinarily complex project, the like of which has never been undertaken in the UK before. When complete, the Elizabeth line will completely transform travel across our city, and we mustn't forget what a fantastic addition to our transport network it will be. But the point I've made to the Crossrail board is they must knuckle down, continue making progress, and deliver the Elizabeth line as soon as possible for Londoners. I'll continue to work closely with the DfT as joint sponsor. Mark, Tony and the board are clear that the Elizabeth line must be completed to the highest possible safety and quality standards. And with your permission, Chair, can I hand over to Tony Megg, who's the Chair of the Crossrail Limited Board.
Lovely. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just thank you, Chairman, and to the Mayor. Just to add a few comments. Look, a year ago, when Mark and I were asked to come and help get this project over the line, the project was in severe disarray. There was no viable plan for completing the work and bringing the railway into operation. Certain stations were far behind the rest, threatening very long delays to the overall programme. There was a considerable gap between Crossrail and contractor estimates of cost and schedule, and there was a complete breakdown of trust between the sponsors and the company. Since then, we've done a great deal to improve the company, its governance and its performance, addressing the major shortcomings outlined above. These improvements, by the way, include acting on essentially all of the recommendations made in your report earlier this year. We have at all times operated with extreme openness and candour, describing both progress and challenges as they have arisen. In my experience, no public project has been subject to the degree of scrutiny and the level of transparency that we've maintained throughout this year. Our earliest opening programme in April contained 4 major tasks: developing and integrating the train and signalling software, completing the station's shafts and portals, completing the routeway, and then when all of that is essentially done, extensive trial running and trial operations to get the train ready for passenger service. We've made good progress against the first 3 items here. The software is now integrated and much further developed. The station shafts and portals are virtually all completed, and the routeway is almost completed and tested. However, the programme will take longer than we expected in April, really for 2 primary reasons. We do need additional time to complete the assurance and handover process. That is the complex integration of all of the systems, which we will happy to talk about in more detail, and making sure that everything is as specified, is working correctly, and is safe and reliable. And this has, quite frankly, turned out to be harder than we had originally anticipated for various reasons that we can again go into. The second is that progress on the software, we've made very good progress on the software, but nevertheless we feel we need 1 or 2 more iterations of the software to develop the reliability we need. Now, I would like to be able to sit here today and give you the new opening programme, but the board is undertaking its sort of response. The executives have provided the board with a revised schedule, but we are undertaking, as the board, a certain level of due diligence right now, an independent review, to make sure that this forecast is as reliable as it possibly can be. We really are sorry, and we do apologise to Londoners, businesses, our sponsors, who are waiting for the Elizabeth line. and nobody is more anxious than we are to get this project done. We're very disappointed that it's going to take longer than we had originally hoped, but we cannot take any shortcuts on this job. Every single thing that we discover as we go through this process needs to be fixed and corrected and built to the highest possible standards. As the Mayor has said, this will be a tremendous addition to London and the South East when it is completed, and you can rest assured that we are working night and day to get this over the line as soon as possible.
Thank you very much indeed for those detailed opening words. I should have just mentioned earlier, we did open this up to all Assembly members, and so we've got additionally today Assembly Member Berry, Devonish and Hall may be coming as well. There's such interest in this subject across the Assembly. If I could start with questions, and I think, Tony, you've just touched on it a bit, but you know, the opening date, in terms of the public and how they see it, the opening date has been changed kind of 4 times since the Crossrail project began. When do you anticipate it will open? Do you want to give us a bit more information on why the opening date just keeps slipping? Because you would think from outside, you give it a bit more time, you'll be able to open it.
Yes, I think as we proceed through this project, first of all, let me say that I really do believe that we have got to the bottom of what needs. First of all, we've made a lot of progress this year, and secondly, we've got to the bottom of what remains to be done. So I'm, subject to the due diligence that we're currently doing, we're going to produce a forecast that we can totally rely on. The reasons for the slippage, I think Mark can help with more detail here. But it is really, as the work has progressed, and we have begun to understand the full amount of work that's required for the final integration and testing, assurance, validation, certification, etc., we have found things that are wrong, materials that are inappropriate, or what. This is very, very detailed work. And now some of this is inevitable in a project of this scale and magnitude. Some of it is quite regrettable. But nevertheless, we are fixing everything as we go, and it is just taking a little bit longer. That one, several months longer than we had originally anticipated.
Do you want to maybe Mark, whether you could give us an actual practical example of something where you found the wrong material has been used or something, just to help us understand this?
So, sorry, I've got a cold, so hope I don't pass it on to anybody, and also hope you can hear me through my cold, unfortunately. So I would say Tony's right. There's 3 areas really of uncertainty, and we took a commitment to be transparent and tell the Mayor, Deputy Mayor Mike, and our other sponsor exactly where we were. And there's a downside to that because you're actually seeing our workings as we're working through it. The reason that we always want to set quite forward-leaning dates is we clearly want to get this railway open as soon as possible. So the easiest thing in the world to do is to kick this for several years and several billions of pounds, but it would help nobody. We've really got to keep the pressure on to drive very, very aggressively towards the front edge of opening windows. So there's always this tension that we have between the earliest possible and the reality of the uncertainty. And there's really three very simple examples. The software is taking probably another spin of the software. That takes about 3 to 4 months every time we change the software. We've just loaded version 11 onto the central operating section. It could be okay for trial running, but more likely we'll need another variant of it. The great news of the software is the systemic problems that we might have had a year ago of will the transitions work are kind of mostly solved. We're now into the very, very fine safety and reliability tuning of the software. To your point about certification, Crossrail is of an immense size. London Underground would do 1 large station every 2 to 3 years, and there's a reason for that. We're doing 30 in about 9 months. Crossrail has 16 million individual parts that distill down to 2.5 million assurable lumps. They get grouped into things. And in there, if you're travelling on a Crossrail station, you can be assured when you're travelling on it, it's at the highest possible standards of fire retardancy, fire suppression, public safety, which means for all those 16 million items, distilling down to 2.5 million sort of bundles of work, we do need the certification. And we have found gaps, you know, when we've tested things. That's why we test the system extensively. I'll give you a great example of why this is so complex. There are 17,000 smoke detectors in Crossrail, and there are 20,000 public address antennas or speakers. 17,000 smoke detectors, 20,000 speakers. Why is that important? Well, actually, if there was a fire in one of our stations, we evacuate it in about 6 to 7 minutes. And we do the evacuation by very careful integration of the fire system with the public address system, with the lift system. And I think what we're finding, and it's lessons, of course, for future projects, we're finding the scale of Crossrail is, we probably underestimated it, but we fully know where we are now, but it takes a lot of time, and we cannot walk past the integration of the fire systems with the public address systems for obvious reasons. So whilst it is frustrating right now that we're picking up delays, it is actually worth the while to spend the investment in the engineering now to get the outcome we need. And the facts are, a lot of these systems are so safety critical, we can't and won't walk past them. So broadly, we haven't really found a lot of defective work. It's more in the integration and the certification. From one single smoke detector right the way up to the system, we need to make sure 20,000 smoke detectors work. So I think that's kind of the challenge we're facing.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you, I think your latest estimate is you'll open as early as possible in 2021. That could mean right up to the end of 2021, realistic. But what confidence can we have in that sort of new timeline you've put out?
Before Mark answers, can I just say, originally, Mark and Tony gave us a 6-month window between, if you remember, October 2020 and March 2021. And you and I both, and others, were very angry that last time we only discovered 4 months before the opening it wasn't going to open. What Mark and Tony and the team could have done is say, we'll still open in that 6-month window, and then lo and behold, approach that and say, we may not make March 21, it may go to April or May. Because we're now demanding transparency, they've been very honest and said, look, we're not going to make the first 3 months of that window. There's still a possibility we could make that window in March 2021, but err on the side of caution, be fully transparent, and I've asked to come back with a new date, and what they've assured me is by early next year we'll have a new window. But I just wanted to explain, we could have, and I'm sure under the old regime, I'd have been told everything's hunky-dory, don't worry, the 6-month window still applies, and we'd be in December 2020 and told it wouldn't. So I welcome the fact they've been open. The downside is, it's a concern, but the good thing is we've got sufficient notice to do mitigation to make sure we try and keep to that window.
Yes, thanks, Mayor. So it's still possible to open this railway in Q1 2021. In fact, the work we've done, we're very confident this railway will open in 2021. I think the work we've done extensively, we've spent our whole lives for a year looking at every nut and bolt of this, and we're very confident this railway will open in 2021. Our objective is to get it as early as possible, and we've produced a plan with a range of uncertainty. The key uncertainties are the software and actually the safety integration of these stations, and we're about to submit that to our board in early January, and I guess the board will consider it.
Yeah, I mean, so just for clarity, in our November board, the executive proposed a revised range of dates. The board accepts the delay and the increase. Accepts. I mean, we understand that, but we are doing quite a lot of work and have asked quite a few questions of the executive, just to be absolutely clear that as and when we revise this window, which will be wholly within 2021, that we don't ever have to do it again.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. We've got a lot of more detailed questions which will get into some of these issues. I want to just pick up with Mike the issue of TfL's, the impact on TfL in terms of revenue, because in your papers for this week's Finance Committee, in fact tomorrow's Finance Committee, it suggests between 500 and 750 million in additional lost revenue as a result of this delay, which TfL is going to have to absorb. So I wonder whether you might comment on that, and whether that also, what time period of delay does that cover? Because that sounds to me like it's longer than a year.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. So yes, you're quite right that the original projections in last year's business plan were that we would see a revenue hit for TfL's revenues of some 600 million. The further delay that was communicated, we have budgeted or put in the plan for a further 750 million delay. And just to give you a sense of how that's broken down, that's 100 million for 2021, 300 million for 21-22, 300 million for 22-23 and 100 million for 23-24. There's some rounding in those numbers, but broadly that's the makeup of that additional 750. I would say that in line with all our demand projections, and actually led to some extent by you and colleagues on the Assembly, we have taken a very prudent approach to our revenue forecast. So any opening earlier in 2021, as Mark has alluded to, would actually give us some upside on that demand projection and therefore revenue numbers. We have taken a very prudent approach, given that we had to construct the business plan clearly in advance of having the clarity of the schedule that Mark and Tony have alluded to. In terms of how we deal with that, well, of course, the business plan, as you will have seen, because it was published last Friday, and I do accept not everybody would have had a chance to go through every detail of it yet, but you will see that in that the net operating costs overall of TfL have reduced from 1.5 billion in 2015-16 down to a projected 307 million at year end for the current financial year. So our track record of really bearing down on costs, operational costs in Transport for London, in the core of Transport for London, go a considerable way to mitigate that additional pressure on demand that we see. There are, of course, other unknowns out there. We don't quite know how the macroeconomic circumstances are going to emerge in the fullness of time. We've had a reasonable start to the financial year up until about October, but actually we've seen some softening in demand, particularly on tube demand, since that date. So we're keeping a very close eye on our core demand projections, and of course that just then will inform any further measures we need to take as we go into next year. But it's also important, I think, to say that just remind us that the three factors we face are Crossrail, of course, are the macroeconomic factors we face, and of course it's the loss of the operating grant from the government, which Assembly members will be, I'm sure, keen to be reminded of the fact that in the government's letter to us in 2015, the removal of the operating grant was explicit in the letter from the then Secretary of State to the then Mayor, explicit as being a dependent issue on Crossrail revenues beginning to come in. Now, clearly, that hasn't materialised, so it will be no surprise to you, Chair, or to Assembly members to know that I am in dialogue and will be, actually, as soon as this afternoon, talking to the Department for Transport and reminding them about the sentence in that particular letter.
Very good, thank you. It's helpful to be reminded on that. The latest project costs announced in November that you're going to need an additional 400 to 650 million. That's just the latest. That's not with your revised schedule and so on. I don't know who would like to take this question, but what are your predictions of the costs of delivering this project?
Could I,
Tony, yeah?
Chair, just sort of say those revised cost estimates, the 400 to 650, do take into account the delays that we have been talking about. So we do not plan to revise these cost estimates again. We do not plan to ask for any more money. The fact that we haven't finally announced the exact opening window is simply because we're doing a little bit more due diligence just to be sure that all the plans are in place. But we have the 400 to 650 comes as a result of some prolongation of the project and some scope gaps that we have found as we've done the work. So just for clarity, when we come back in January with a new opening window, we will not come back in January with a new cost estimate.
Okay, so that brings the total to around 18.25 billion to deliver this project. Where is the extra money going to come from just to fill this gap?
Well, those are conversations we are having with the DFT. As you'll appreciate, because of the election unheard, and not criticising anybody, we couldn't have those conversations during the election campaign.
Yeah.
And Mike alluded to conversations he's having with the DFT, and you know, those are some things we'll be discussing with them, the issue of the capital costs, as well as the issue of the lost fares and revenues. That was baked into the 15-16 spend review.
Okay, so hopefully we'll hear about that in the new year.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Assembly Member Shaw.
Yeah, on the question of cost, Mr. Mayor, appreciate that you need to have discussions with DFT to meet the additional demand. I mean, given the scenario that they don't meet the entire cost and there's demand from GLA to fund it. This is something came up in our scrutiny yesterday, discussions on budget and performance committee. I mean, where do you reckon that room for funding will be? What will have to go? Because obviously there are pressures on GLA funding itself, and then on top of that, if you have to fund any part of increase on Crossrail, how would you square that circle?
Well, firstly, it's worth just putting on record, and I'm sure the Commission would agree, that the DFT have been extremely collaborative, particularly over the last year. So if you remember, the agreement we reached with the government last year was a loan agreement in relation to a loan with the GLA and a separate arrangement with TfL, which covered the increased expenditure in relation to the previous regime, if you don't mind me using that phrase. In relation to the discussions we're having with the DFT now, it's in relation to how we fund the additional capital costs and also the lost revenues we're talking about from them. You'll have heard Martin and David in relation to what they said to the Budget Committee yesterday. It's an ongoing conversation we're having with the government, dare I say, a negotiation. Now, you'll be aware the way Crossrail is funded is unique. It's funded by a combination of central government through taxation, but also a combination of London businesses, but London taxpayers paying for it as well. The point that the National Infrastructure Commission made was these projects benefit the entire country. And so, for example, if you look at the benefits to the country, the project's expected to generate between 40 billion and 70 billion for the UK economy, which begs the question, shouldn't HMG be contributing more towards any additional expenditure we're going to face? And there's other benefits the country gets from Crossrail, which, by the way, starts outside London and finishes outside London as well. So those are part of the conversations we'd be having. I wouldn't want to rehearse those negotiations in public, but that's a flavour of some of the conversations that Mike will be having with the DFT. And just to say, for the avoidance of doubt, the relationship is a very good one. We are joint sponsors. Similarly, the Crossrail board has the same candour with them as they have with us, and I'm optimistic that we'll reach a negotiation with the DFT that suits everybody.
On funding,
I've got a couple of
okay, on funding,
quick,
and then I'll bring
funding,
in. Brilliant.
I mean, Tony, I am somewhat reassured from your comments you made that the additional cost indication that you made covers the overrun and additional period required for completion. But I'm afraid we've heard this before in this chamber. And again, we have a situation where the cost has escalated. In fact, looking at the original funding that was agreed at 15.9, and given the current increase that we have, that constitutes about 15%, which is huge increase on the project cost. And if you were to look at it, 14.8 billion, then it's a staggering 23.3% increase on the original contract value of this project. I accept that it's complex and it's been difficult to peg the cost down. My worry is, could we be sitting around next year and looking at further cost increase on the project? This is serious worry. How can you reassure when the last predictions or projections have failed?
I think we can be very confident that in the latest cost estimates, the reason I say that is because, you know, when these cost estimates say were made at the end of last year, that was without a real understanding at that time of what was actually left to be done. Now, as we have gone through this year, first of all, we've progressed a lot of the work. We've actually physically achieved a huge amount of completion of work. And secondly, we have a far better in-depth understanding of exactly what is left to be done. The third thing I would say is, you know, the big money really goes on the physical work and completing the stations, and the station shafts, portals, and the tunnel. And a lot of that work is now coming to completion. So I would be lying to you if I said I 100% guarantee that there will be no further cost increases. But I can say to you, I have a high level of confidence in the management team, in the work that has been done over the last year, and in our grip and grasp of this project. These are their estimates. We as the board have scrutinized them very heavily, and we are really confident that we've got A, good team, and B, a very good grasp on what remains to be done in this project.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Arbour, you wanted to come in here.
I think it's to you, Mike. It's very difficult for ordinary Londoners to understand the impact of this because, of course, it's not something that's been taken away. It's something we've been looking forward to. But I do want to ask you questions about what has been taken away. Have TfL produced a list of projects which would have gone ahead but will no longer go ahead because of the project overruns and the loss of income?
I think our business plan, Chair, through you, is very clear on the things that are still going ahead in terms of the major investment around the completion of the Bank Station project, the Northern Line extension, the re-signalling of the what we call subsurface lines, still going ahead, the procurement of the new Piccadilly line trains and the new Docklands light railway trains, that is all still going ahead. So there's an awful lot of record levels of investment going ahead, as well as, of course, the continued electrification of London's bus fleet, which is very important, with 2,000 buses being fully electric by the end of the business plan period, continuing also with the retrofit programme for Euro 6 minimum standards.
I have asked you about the things which aren't going to happen.
Indeed, Chair, but I'm just trying to emphasise the huge swathe of things that are still happening.
Yeah.
The extension of the ultra-low emission zone, of course, very successful as it's already been. But in terms of things that we've been very upfront and said that will not be proceeding at the same pace as we originally intended. We had already talked about the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf pedestrian and cycling bridge being reviewed now as to what we might do as an alternative link across that very important pedestrian and cycle link there. We talked about Camden and Holborn Station, which are two projects that we would have sought to go ahead with had we had the necessary funding to do that. Actually, we're still in dialogue with the government, and it goes back to what the Mayor so eloquently described as the ongoing discussion with government generally in advance of a further spending review. We're still very optimistic. We'll keep working on the signalling upgrade for the Piccadilly line, which is a really important project. We haven't yet got certainty enough on our capital funding going forward because of the government needs to make a decision on the retained business rate supplement, which is not yet clear going forward, so it doesn't yet allow me to take to the board a proposal for a procurement of Piccadilly line signalling, but I'm optimistic we'll continue that debate. So there are some genuine things. It's all very explicit in the business plan as what is no longer able to be done. But, you know, I'm still confident there's an awful lot going down, including, of course, the renewal of our existing asset base, which shouldn't be understated. It's very important. Anyone who read the Guardian article just yesterday will have seen the contrast between other metros somewhere else across the Atlantic and our metro and the importance of sustained funding.
No consolation to Londoners and to my constituents in particular. There are a couple of projects in my constituency, and I think this will help bring it home to people if you look at it at a distant level. For example, something which affects a great many of them are the less frequent running of buses. which has been created by this. And this is something which people understand. They don't understand the hundreds of millions, the extra 750 million loss of revenue. That's meaningless to them. But they do understand the fact that they have to wait 5 minutes longer for a bus.
Well, can I just say on that, Chair, that of course one of the things that we've been doing is ensuring that the bus service is configured for the current demand projection and the growth areas in London, particularly in outer London, where we have added new bus routes, for example, just recently to Kidbrooke. In Greenwich, where there's some new housing, new homes being developed. We've added new bus routes there and
no
across.
Consolation to my constituents in Chiswick about an improvement in a bus route in Greenwich.
Well, I would just say, Chair, that London still has way and away the most comprehensive full bus service of any part of this UK,
yes.
and will continue to do so.
We're all proud of that.
Absolutely.
I answer to my constituents, and
Of course. theoretically
you answer to the mayor,
Yeah.
and theoretically the mayor answers to us. Not very often, but it's theoretically, the mayor answers to us. So and I have to tell people, they say, why do I have to wait long? Why do I have to wait long for the bus? And the bus doesn't go as far as it used to. And, and I can very tritely say, which I do, well, the mayor got it wrong on Crossrail.
Well, I do think
another
that
project, can I raise another couple of things which, again, might well bring it home to ordinary Londoners. People might think, for example, that had there not been this loss of money, work on a replacement of Hammersmith Bridge, for example, would have been much quicker, and it would have been dealt with as a matter of urgency. There are some unpopular things which you are progressing with, which you might not need to do. If I can cite again in Chiswick, you're progressing with CW9, which is something which is exceedingly unpopular, but you're spending money on that. It may be that if you were to localise, and I understand the point you're making about the business plan, that if we had it project by project, borough by borough, people would understand the terrible impact that the mistakes made over Crossrail are having for all Londoners. That's really a rhetorical point, Mike. So
Well,
you
if I
don't
could
need
just,
to answer
if
that.
it, well, perhaps if I could just say one thing, Chair, because I would just say on Hammersmith Bridge, so there's been an extraordinary amount of great work done, led by the Deputy Mayor, Gareth Powell, and my team, working with Hammersmith and Fulham Borough, who of course own the bridge. It's not a TfL bridge. There was previously, prior to the change of the funding from central government, there was previously provision in our budgets for actually being able to maintain and keep up the effectiveness of these assets in London. That has fallen away. I met with the previous Chancellor just a few months ago, and we had a very useful discussion about that and how we begin to address this more strategically in terms of London's bridges, where there is a huge myriad of ownership and operational issues, which I do think needs straightened out. Of course, I very much regret that it's caused some quite significant local displacement of traffic. I do recognise that issue, but there is a very clear plan now that the Deputy Mayor has agreed with the leader of Hammersmith and Fulham, which sees a significant TfL contribution to take us to the first stage of working that through. And actually, on cycling, Chair, if I may, through you, I make no apology for continuing to work on cycleways across London. This is one of the huge successes of recent years, where we have seen a real increase in people cycling, which is a good way to travel around the city. And also, of course, I will never make an apology for something that tackles some of the safety issues that we've seen from cyclists around our city previously as well. So I'm very proud of the work the team has been doing on cycling. And to be honest, Chair, through you, and I'm not talking about your particular constituency, Tony, but if I may, across London, when you look at the previous provision of 101 buses per hour up Kingsway in Holborn, and you wonder what the biggest impedance to bus reliability up Kingsway was, well, guess what? It was another bus. The bus network in London hadn't been properly looked at for 25 years. It was long overdue, and I'm very proud that we're now developing new routes and serving new communities in developing areas in outer London.
Lovely, thank you. we're going to pick up a lot of this with you, Mike, when you come before us early in the new year.
I'm
We're
looking
gonna have a
forward to
big
the ready,
roundup.
Chair.
It's going to be really good to hear your views on these things. One more member, Assembly Member Devonish, on the finance, and then we're going to move to the next section, members.
Do you mind? My question is following on really from Assembly Member Arbour. He referred to a borough-by-borough breakdown of what's being cut. Could you provide that for everything that's being cut, specifically to do with the increase in cost in Crossrail to the committee?
We could do, except, Chair, that I think I just have to emphasise that we don't look at London in a borough-by-borough perspective, because actually that's not the way Londoners lead their life. I know you know that, but it's just not. It's not the way London operates, and it's not the way that we think of it as transport for London, not transport for an individual borough. And also, if I could just go back to the point I made earlier, and I'm not trying to be smart here, but the point I made earlier is that there are more than one issues at play here in terms of our financing. One is the reduction in the operating grant to zero from the government, going back to the letter of 2015 from the previous Secretary of State to the previous Mayor. So that's a factor. The macroeconomic situation is a very real factor, because a very small percentage, a very small proportion of 1% of tube revenue falling is absolutely material in terms of our funding projections. And of course that materialises across London, materialises actually particular times of the day, times of the week, particular stations, particular journeys. So that's material as well. But I can certainly, and maybe it is relevant for the session in January, Chair, if I may, come back at that time with a kind of assessment of where this is in the overall reach. But of course I don't, in a granular basis, look down and just look at one revenue source or capital reallocation as to what that means for a budget, because the business plan is produced, and you will have, I'm sure, had an opportunity to at least have a look at it since it was published on Friday, and you will have more chance, I'm sure, before I come back in January. But that explains very clearly about where our position is and what our projection is over the next 5 years.
Thank you. It's on my reading list for Christmas. Can I ask one final question? You referred to your improvements on the cycle lanes. Could you, when you come back in January, give a breakdown of kilometre increase in cycle lanes under this administration?
I'd be delighted to.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we'll look at the information.
Yeah.
I think Budget Committee has had a huge list of projects and where they are, so it might be just about sharing that with all members. So that information is available. Let's move on to the progress across Crossrail. And Assembly Member Curtin, you're going to open this.
Good morning. So I'd just like to ask you about progress of the projects. And obviously, you know, Jacobs, the project representative, produces monthly reports. And he's noted that there are multiple risks that have not been addressed or mitigated. So I wonder if one of you could tell me what you think are the major risks, and what are you doing, how have you responded to what Jacobs has said?
So I would say the project representative in our year doing it, I'm sure Tony would agree, our relationship with the project representative is very, very constructive. They have access all areas. So what you're reading is a genuine independent view and reflective view for the sponsors, actually not for us or our board. So there's nothing hidden from the project representative, so they're giving you a fair view of what they think, and we find that constructive. The risks going forward, we are at a very challenging point of the programme. It was always going to be difficult and hard. If you go and look, for example, at Tottenham Court Road Station or Farringdon Station, they are really impressive structures, and they look like we could almost open them now. I'm sure people have been to Farringdon, but kind of behind the mask, there is a lot of integration work to do. So our first risk really, particularly in the station shafts portals, is this really complicated integration work that the fire alarms have to match the lifts. And it's quite complex work, and we can't take any shortcuts. So for example, if you are in a lift in one of our big stations and you get trapped, you can be reassured that an alarm will go off and the CCTV camera will beam on you and you will be communicated with within a short number of minutes. There are hundreds of those lifts and escalators in Crossrail. So the first risk, I think, David, is the integration. We have a good grip on it, but it is uncertain because while you're testing something, we find problems and gaps. The second risk really is in the software development. We've uploaded version 11 of the software. I was with Mike with the big boss of Bombardier, Alan Belmar, who is the global chair, I think, executive chair of Bombardier. Yeah. And we reflected on the progress in 2019 on converging the software. If you go back a year, we had several software systems that couldn't talk to each other, and one of our most notable achievements in the year is to bring the software of Siemens and Bombardier together. We're just uploading it now, and after Christmas we start the final iteration of testing, and in there, if we find problems, we need to fix them. So whilst we're very confident, with any software system of this complexity and safety integrity, we might still get problems in the software. And the third element of risk is in the routeware, the tunnel. One of our most notable achievements, I think, is by the end of January, the tunnel is finished. Everything's installed. Even now, the radio systems, these very complicated radio systems, are fully installed in the routeware. The track's in, the overhead line's in, the point machines are in, the radio systems are in, the platform screen doors are now fully commissioned. We've just finished the very last commissioning of electrification. People will remember the Pudding Mill Lane explosion. Do you remember that?
Of course.
Of 2 years ago. Well, in our year, we've actually rebuilt a 400,000 volt substation at Pudding Mill Lane and corrected the explosion. So the routeware is ready, but it is a large linear asset of 42 kilometres, and the assurance of that, again, is a bit of a challenge. So, David, the uncertainty we face is really in software development and the hooking up and integration of these millions of assets. The positive is we've got a firm grip on this, but as we test things, it might be that we find things and we just simply can't walk past it. We've kind of wound the minimum requirements down to the absolute minimum. We've got brilliant support from TfL, London Underground. The operator is embedded in our organisation, part of our organisation. But when we get into testing at this level, it's the biggest thing anybody has ever done in UK railways, and probably the biggest integration job in Europe that's ever occurred. So at that scale, we'd be a bit naive to say it wasn't actually a very challenging thing. But we've got the right team, we've got the grip, and I think by the time we get to kind of February, March, April next year, a lot of these risks will start to be retired, particularly in the software, which is a big moment for us. Yep.
Can I just add a couple of remarks there? First of all, we welcome the PREP's caustic input to our program. They attend, their senior representative comes to all of our board meetings. Not only do they provide a healthy critique, they also add real value through their experience and suggestions. Secondly, we have taken note of some of their comments about aggressive, and that is one of the reasons, part of the input into the revision to the forecast. So many of the comments that they've made will be addressed as we revise the forecast. And then the third thing to say is that indeed the cost forecasts that we have provided you with do contain the lower bound number, the 400 over, contains some 400 million, which is about 30% of that is actually risk. It's not allocated to a specific thing right now. It is to allow for the possibility of overrun. And the higher number, the 650, contains nearly 600 million of risk altogether in our cost to go. So, we are trying to provide for all eventualities here.
Thank you. That's a comprehensive answer. But I'd just like to bring up one thing that was mentioned in the status report 127, because Jacob suggests that the risk assessment conducted by Crossrail did not actually reflect the real risk. If I could read to you something. It says in that report, it's from June and July this year, this period we have reviewed the phasing of Crossrail's risk register. Currently, Crossrail does not phase the risks, and we believe the current assessment does not adequately cover the future risks that may be encountered. How have you addressed that comment in particular, in that assessment?
So that was from June, July, I think, David, and we've really actually valued, not caustic, but we've valued their independent scrutiny of us. And since June, July, the project really has moved a long way. In August, we formed a delivery control schedule, which for the first time really, for several years, formed a clear plan to complete Crossrail. And subsequent to that, we've got further into the integration. So I would say those comments might be a little bit outdated to where we are today. If you look at the very latest PREP reports, they talk more of the challenge facing us. And I would say if you ever got a spare moment over Christmas, look at the PREP reports from October, November last year, and they are very clear that Crossrail didn't have a plan to complete. Now, I think PREP are saying we're facing up to a very significant engineering challenge. And when Crossrail is commissioned, I think we will look back as one of the singular engineering achievements of the age, actually. So I think we've turned a big corner with PREP, and I think those comments might be a little bit outdated.
Okay. I was going to ask you about something else from the same period and the same report. You might say this is outdated as well, but they sort of brought up some issues with perhaps the risk to the trial running starting in accordance with the delivery control schedule. Have you addressed that as well?
I mean, that's a good example. So in June, July, we thought of a trial running start between February 21 and May 21. And 20, sorry, apologies, thank you very much. May 20 to May 20.
February.
February 20.
It's a cold,
My
don't
cold is
worry.
getting me. Previously, we
Yeah.
thought about a May 20 to May,
Feb
sorry,
to
a
May
February
20.
20 to a May 20 start. And they were really identifying in the summer that we're under great pressure. And really, what you've seen, the real reason that we can't achieve a opening in 2020 is delays to our trial running. So I think that's a really good example where they were highlighting concerns. I would say, though, the executive's job is to push as hard as possible, safely obviously, at the leading edge, because everybody needs this railway open as early as possible. Their job is to scrutinise and provide independent scrutiny, and the board's job is really to wrap it all up into a considered position. I think we're kind of working well together. It's a good example of us working well together.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasise that. They said, these deadlines are under real pressure. Those deadlines were driving a lot of very good work, but they became unrealistic. Well in advance, we have shifted those. We still want to, but middle of next year is when we expect to enter trial running. And so we are absolutely taking on board the comments that we get. And, we are heavily scrutinised for all quarters. And we take those comments and advice seriously.
Okay,
Can
thank you.
I just pause you there before your next question, and just because we're talking about trial running and the software systems. Assemblymember McCartney had a question on software.
Just a quick question for Mark. One of our recommendations from the report, we noted that although you'd had the right skill set Crossrail at the start of the project, there really wasn't sufficient skill set for the systems integration at the end of the programme. And I know last time we were here, you were saying that you were aware of that. Obviously, because you're now testing the system, I take it that hurdle has been overcome. But was that a difficulty?
Yeah, I mean, I think an achievement in the area is we've built a system integration facility. We call it the Plateau, fancy name. What it means is a collaborative environment with Crossrail Limited, the drivers, the London Underground people, but crucially Bombardier and Siemens. So at West Ferry Circus, we have, I would think, the state-of-the-art of a software integration facility. At Chippenham in the West Country, we've built our emulation facility, like the laboratory, to be a much higher level. And Mike and I were just in Branchfire actually a couple of weeks ago, the Siemens facility. And Siemens, there is no doubt that Siemens and Bombardier are absolutely putting Crossrail #1 in their pipeline. I think you would agree, Mike. And it's really heartening that. So I think we've got the right team, we've got the right environment, the right collaborative environment, and we've got the right support of the supply chain. And the really good news of the software is the systemic problems that we worried about, the transitions, the network rail interfaces, are largely proven now. The problem is they've got to be proven to hundreds of millions of times of reliability. So I think we've come a long way. And in the world of railway signalling, there aren't many people in the world who aren't here doing this job. And it's interesting that the software has been built in 20 facilities by about 1,500 people all over the world right at this very minute. It's probably the biggest software push in railways at this very moment in the world, and we've got the best people on this, and we're seeing the fruits of it. But it's highly uncertain until you start testing it properly, because one safety bug can knock us out. And I know everybody understands that. We've come a long way in a year in software, I think.
Very reassuring. Just quickly before I move back to David, when is trial running going to start?
Well, the current range we have is sometime between July, August towards September, October. That's our current range. We're going to take that to the board. That's part of the scrutiny, actually, that the board have asked us to do. So that work's not exactly complete, but certainly my ambition is this project desperately needs to define some date of trial running. So it'll be in that range. I'm absolutely confident about that. The precise where we do that and the narrowness and wideness of that window is a matter for the board in January, I think.
So, but between July and October is when you start. And previously you've told me it would take 9 to 12 months from that start of trial testing before it can open. So you are realistically looking at the end of 2021 before you can open that bit of the railway.
From the start of trial running, the conventional wisdom is 9 to 12 months to shake it down. It's an enormously complicated system and we will find issues. The reason we might mitigate that and reduce that period is actually if we get good quality software in February, March next year, whilst we're finishing this stations integration, we could actually start the process of shaking down earlier. So one of the things the board has asked us to look at is, are there opportunities of shaking the system down earlier than the actual defined start of trial running? There's complexities with that. We've got to do it very safely. But there are opportunities actually to reduce the 9 to 12 months, Caroline. It depends how much software, how mature it is in February, March next year.
So
but
we need to be asking you how mature your software is in the new year then, is that right?
You can, yeah, and we will have an answer for that. It is possible to reduce the 9 to 12 months if during the spring of next year we do some reliability growth. But these are all the things.
If not, it will take 9 to 12 months.
Yeah, if we didn't do that, but of course the history of this project, including my predecessors, is to work creatively and agilely at every challenge that faces us. So I think in the spring of next year we'll have good quality software that might not be quite ready for trial running, but is enough to start the shakedown process. And that's where our focus is.
For that. Assemblymember Curtin.
Thanks. Just one final question for me on the project reports. The monthly updates seem to indicate there's been a decline in performance in terms of safety, and there's been numerous sort of mentions of near misses. Can you say anything about that? Why has that happened, and what are your plans to deal with that?
So I'll say that maybe Tony could add from the board's point of view. So we've been invited to take this challenge over. Tony and I took two stands. We'd be fully transparent and we'd own the whole of integration. But before that, the commitment we've made is to nobody getting hurt on Crossrail and our full commitment to target zero. It is entirely possible to finish this project without a cut finger. We work really collaboratively with our sort of supply chain. And if you do look at our safety performance optically, it's kind of very similar to where the Olympics were, or maybe it's even where Mike's major projects business is, which is a very capable organisation safety-wise. The things you're looking at, David, are actually high potential near misses. We measure actually things that could have gone wrong. And in the year, at the beginning of this year, we had quite a rise of things that could go wrong, particularly around running the operational railway. We put a huge focus, actually probably more focus, into high potential near misses in terms of their root cause analysis than other things than a cut finger, because a high potential near miss is quite serious. The good news is actually, if you look at the trend from the early part of this year, which I think was really the mobilization of a railway, we're now running trains at 100 kilometers an hour under a 25,000 volt electrification. If you look at our high potential near miss rate now, one's too many, but we've generally seen a coming down, positive coming down, and our commitment is to keep going with it. So I think it's a product of quite a healthy culture, I think.
Well, just to say that from the board's perspective, first of all, this is the first item on every board agenda, on every board meeting. Secondly, I and my deputy attend every monthly senior safety meeting. We do, as the board, all members of the board go out and visit stations and discuss safety. I think we're doing a huge amount. Are we satisfied? Absolutely not. We don't want a single incident on this railway, and it's a source of constant, concern. And you know, if we have a very bad accident in the completion of this railway, we will have failed. We just do not want that to happen.
Can I just ask you, Mark, about figures? I mean, when was the high point? Which month, which period was the high
in high
point?
potential near misses, if you look at the period between January this year and March, April this year, I think we've had 50 high potential near misses in the calendar year. Half of them were in the first quarter. So I would look there. Yep.
Okay, so, and what about the most recent quarter?
Oh, interestingly, in the past period, we've seen a rise in the past period. Not to those levels, but we've seen a little rise. The heartening thing is, though, that the very concerning thing at the beginning of the year in starting an operational railway up, testing in amongst the construction site, we've seen a big improvement in eradicating errors, mistakes in the operational railway, which is our first biggest risk that we have. So I think we'll see that relentless pressure, but as Tony says, one isn't satisfactory to us.
When you say a period, is that a 4-week period?
4 weeks, yeah.
So
4 weeks.
sort of the first quarter would have been about 25, but I mean you divide that into periods, that would have been sort of 8 or 9
That's
per
right.
period. And what was the most recent period?
Well,
of
so
4 weeks?
during the spring, summer, we were down to either 0 or 2 or 3. Interestingly, in the last period, we had 4 or 5. So
Okay.
it's, you know, in other words, you've got to keep absolutely relentless focus on this, which we are. But the
Okay.
4 or 5 we had last period were actually construction related. People leaving their materials in the wrong place or something that wasn't right in the construction methodology. We haven't really seen the return, thankfully, of the operational risks, and we put a lot of focus into the operational railway risk now. We've come a long way in a year, and it's relentless, and we don't take this in any way complacency.
Okay, right.
Just say something on this. I know I haven't said anything so far. I mean, every single meeting that I have with Mark and Tony, we don't talk about progress on the project until we've talked about safety. And I don't think there is any issue that is more important to Mark and Tony than safety. My understanding is that Crossrail have got a new director of health and safety in the last year, that there's been a huge number of activities, you're stepping up weeks. And so I do think that the focus on this in both the executive and the board is very, very rigorous.
Okay,
Thank you. Right, I've got Assembly Member Russell, and then I've got Assembly Member Devenish and Bailey wanting to come in.
Thank you. Yes, just continuing on safety, the latest project status report that we just got through last night, in fact, says that Crossrail Limited must not lose sight of the fact that the Tier 1 contractors are accountable for the safety of their workforce and supply chain, and we would have expected a more proactive approach from their perspective. Is there, Mark and possibly Tony may want to come in, is there an issue with the contractors? Is that where the safety risks are sitting at the moment?
We're allowed to disagree with the PREP, of course, in that context. And no, I don't actually agree with that sentiment. Every 4 weeks, in fact tomorrow, we meet all of our Tier 1 supply chain. They are accountable mostly for our safety performance, and I've not detected any lack of focus and push from all of our Tier 1 contractors. In fact, Siemens, who are doing the, not so much the signalling, but the hooking up of CCTV, they've just won an award for globally the best performance of any Siemens team. So I think my perspective is, how I would read that is, we need to have continuous focus by the supply chain on it. I certainly don't feel that I haven't got the commitment of the supply chain, but it's a fair point to that we need to maintain that.
Yep.
Can I just add a small thing? I mean, no, actually a big thing. I think this week, or it may have been the end of last week, we had under the auspices of Crossrail, got together first-line supervisors who are really the real people who drive safety on site more than anybody else. So first-line supervisors, 70 of them, from all companies right across the whole project, for half a day in 2 sessions of sort of safety workshop, conversation, training. So there's a huge amount of effort being put in by the contractors with Crossrail to kind of make sure that the people who direct the work on a daily basis are really on the case.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. I'm just going to raise something else that's in this PREP report. It says risk management process is still relatively immature with a focus on risk accounting rather than the identification and management of the risks themselves. Is that something you recognise?
I do. When we were invited to take this project over a year ago, the project had been hollowed out. You know, the day I walked in at Canary Wharf, there was no project controls team, there was no risk team, there's no communication. We're a very small communications team. So in the course of the year, we've rebuilt it. We've rebuilt, I would say, good quality project controls, good quality risk management. But having had such a dramatic demobilisation of Crossrail, there's inevitably maturity issues. We're on the improvement, I think, and it's one of the big challenges of the board in the Audit and Assurance Committee to make sure that we focus on that. And if you do look at our costs to go, so our costs to go at we call the P50 level, which is kind of the £400 million level, the biggest cost to go we have is in risk. You know, the biggest collection of costs isn't with a contractor, it's in us mitigating and preventing things happening. So I really do agree with PREP. It's a consequence, though, of taking over nothing a year ago and building it up to something quite good, but not quite as mature as we want, and much more work to do that in the first quarter of next year.
So, I mean, can you just tell us a bit more then about how you're actually monitoring the impact of the safety initiatives that you're introducing, and tell us, you know, how effective you think they are at improving workplace safety?
Yeah, we have a new Health and Safety Director, Carol Bardale-Wise, which I think all of us would agree has brought a new set of impetus to us. We refreshed our Target Zero plan, so we have a very clear plan that involves our supply chain, the board, and our operators. The operators, one of the big changes in the year, the operators, London Underground, MTR, and now TfL, are now in our organisation, share the dashboard, which is a really big change in the year, actually, the collaborative spirit. How do we measure it? Well, as Heidi says, we have a dashboard that we publish every week. I would say, and I've been in this business for a long time now, Crossrail's leading indicators is probably one of the better in the world, actually. The challenge is how you assess the competency of the people doing it and the effectiveness of leading indicators. So a leading indicator being we measure how many safety briefings somebody's given that day rather than counting up whether anybody's had an accident. So we've got a real focus on we've got 5 golden rules on Crossrail, and we relentlessly look at our leading indicators, how many briefings have happened, how many times have a golden rule been reinforced, and we measure it every single week. Every 4 weeks we get all the supply chain together. Every 4 weeks we talk to our board about it, and it's a relentless process. And every 6 months we have Stepping Up Week, which we close the whole project down to a focus on safety. And that's quite remarkable. Despite all the pressures that we have, we focus on safety for a whole week. We still get production done, but the focus of the week is safety. And I think that's where our focus needs to be. The challenge is it's relentless and there is no game for complacency. The real risk to us is previously in major civil engineering, you'd have large groups of operatives, maybe 50 to 200 people, around a civil engineering structure. We're now in this very, very vast labyrinthine technical infrastructure where people are often working in small groups and in dark corners and small corners of the infrastructure. Hence Tony's point, frontline supervision and the setting to work of people and the absolute standing in their shoes, in their health and well-being is our challenge. Because often people are working in quite isolated spots. But today we're managing it quite well, actually, but more to do.
So when the PREP report sort of says, suggests that interventions made by Crossrail to improve safety performance are not, and I quote, flowing through to an improvement in results, you would say that is now out of date, or do you recognise that there is still an issue there?
I would say it's always fair to be challenged on safety, and there's no competition for safety, and in fact I quite like the challenge. I would think, though, if you looked at our current safety performance, whilst not one accident, a high potential near miss is acceptable, since that was written, we're on a stronger trajectory. but there is no room for complacency, particularly at the stage of the project we're at with all this quite fine work in small corners of our organisation.
Yep, no, that sounds full of risk. Moving on more specifically to look at air quality issues on the Crossrail project. Now, I note that the board has been asking you quite a lot of questions about air quality, which is presumably after was it 5 deaths happened from people who'd been working at Bond Street? So what safety measures have you put into place to proactively improve the air quality at Bond Street? And what were the findings of the independent air quality survey that Costain Skanska joint venture and the 4 Rail Services Limited completed?
Well, first of all, it's very sad that actually I think it's 4 colleagues specifically on our records. It's very, very sad that 4 colleagues passed away between February and August, I think. And unfortunately, some of those deaths actually happened in very close proximity to each other. Obviously, we're not party to those people's medical records, except it's very sad that our colleagues passed away. And that had a big effect, actually, at Bond Street. If you look at air quality, though, every site of ours has extensive air quality plans. As you'd imagine, when this was being built, air quality and dust, if you go to Mike's bank station now, they put a lot of effort into air quality and dampening down the dust. We're kind of not in that situation anymore. So our construction sites are no longer very, very dust prone, but dust still does exist. Specifically at Bond Street, with our trade union colleagues, we've worked extensively in independently testing the air. The same person actually who does TfL's air testing. And at Bond Street, we found no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. And we've continued doing that testing at Bond Street. And in fact, we're rolling it out now to every station, and Shafton Portal and the tunnel. We've also asked the Tier 1 contractors to refresh their dust management plans, because dust is an issue for construction workers, but we're not really at the situation we were maybe 4 or 5 years ago with big civil engineering. So my commitment is to keep the Tier 1 contractors challenged to keep their dust management at the right level, and also do independent reviews. To date, we've found no problems with dust, but it is very sad that 4 people died at Bond Street, but we can't actually find a correlation to it. All we can do is keep the air as clean as possible, and at the moment, I think our trade union colleagues would agree we've done the best we can in this situation.
Just going back to the dust, the sort of makeup of the particles, because the Environment Committee here have been looking at tube dust and the very high concentrations of PM 2.5 particles that are in the underground system. Presumably the dust on the Crossrail stations is more construction dust rather than the kind of dust that we're looking at in the tube system.
I mean, the offer I would make is we have a comprehensive report actually on the composition of the dust, and subject to our board agreeing, which I'm sure they would, I'm happy to share the dust results. And you're exactly right, Caroline. The tube dust, as you know, is a much more complex issue with brake dust and all sorts of things. In Crossrail, we're talking about concrete dust, really, because our trains there's not many trains running because we're only testing, and the braking systems on our trains really are at the more modern side of where, unlike in the tube where there are challenges there. So I will provide our dust management plan and the results, and you'll find it is actually relatively minor construction dust, but I will provide the evidence of that.
Thank you very much for that. And then before I think some other members want to come in, how do you think Crossrail workers are feeling about their safety, not just around the air pollution, but their safety in general, but also obviously following those deaths relating to workers at Bond Street?
We work very progressively, I think, with the trade union there, and I think at Bond Street there was a lot of concern to find 4 colleagues passing away tragically in a short period of time. So I think for a brief period of time at Bond Street there was justifiable concern, and hopefully we acted with our trade union colleagues constructively. Generally, on the broader project, having just come through Stepping Up Week, where all of our board members, all of our executive went to every single site, and we probably had 4,000 people stepping up, I would report back that morale's high, people want to get the job done, there's a strong focus on safety, and I haven't detected anything other than a great bunch of people wanting to safely get the job done. I don't know if you have, Tony.
No, I just would add to that. There's also, within the sort of health and safety arena, quite a focus on mental health as well. And Carol Bardell-Wise, our new safety director, is a particular sort of specialist in that area. So, you see on-site workshops and programs and things designed not just to make sure that people are physically safe, which is obviously highest priority, but actually to make sure that they're sort of, as in as good a sort of mental shape as possible. So it's stressful. Look, it's stressful finishing any kind of major project. It's very stressful finishing this project. If it wasn't stressful, it would never finish. And that's a sort of paradox. But we are doing everything we can to look after people's general well-being.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Devonish on safety.
Thank you. Can I start with Mr. Mayor? The story, I don't know if you saw it this morning on City AM, it's a very responsible newspaper. This was on the front page in terms of high potential near misses, i.e. potential deaths or serious injuries. And if I understand the story correctly, you guys picked up last December that there was a problem, and subsequent to that meeting, the figures got worse all this year. So I just wondered if the Mayor himself would like to reassure both Londoners, and more importantly those working on Crossrail, that there isn't a safety problem in the culture of Crossrail, please.
Definitely isn't. Heidi's experience with the meetings she's had are the same as mine in relation to every meeting. I've been to 2 Crossrail board meetings and had meetings with Tony and Mark very frequently, every 6 weeks. The very first thing raised at the Crossrail board meeting in my presence, but also whenever I meet these two, is safety, which is, if you think about it, it is a bit odd if you're a layperson, because you would have thought the first thing should be progress, but it's not, it's safety. I just want to reassure Londoners through you, firstly. Secondly, for obvious reasons, because of my background, and which you know about and often make a political point of, the views of workers are quite important to me. And you've heard the Chief Executive on a number of occasions talk about conversations with the trade unions, not in a pejorative way, as some colleagues do in this Assembly, but in a way of demonstrating the relationship to and fro. And so a good example was the Chief Executive hearing, by the way, as Caroline Russell said, legitimate concerns from workers because colleagues had passed away, justifiable concerns, and taken them seriously. And just to reassure you, Tony, I saw the City AM piece this morning, and you're right, it is a responsible paper. And the very first thing I did was to get further reassurance that the reassurance I'd received on many occasions is justified. And the good news is, and it goes to the question Caroline asked about suppliers and contractors, there is a one-team approach when it comes to safety. What this team don't do is subcontract safety to the subcontractors, if that makes sense. If there's a chance it's appropriate, Mark, I'm sure you could give a briefing to colleagues about the Stepping Up Week and what that entails, because I think when I first discovered this, I was quite impressed, and it is quite impressive. There's a 1-minute explanation which just explains the priority these guys give to safety.
Yeah, so it's constant through the year, of course, but every 6 months we take a week and we focus on several topics, and by stepping up we mean every single worker on Crossrail during the course of a lot of events during the week will step up into a safety conversation. And it's been proven, I think, and if you do look at Crossrails, if you look at the data, I think our stepping up weeks have generally had a positive effect on the reduction of risk. And just to say, Tony, the high potential near misses in the early part of this year are kind of different to the ones we're seeing at the end of the year, which is a consequence of the focus we put into the operational rail work. But one's too many.
That's very reassuring. Can I ask 2 following questions? We were 50 minutes into the meeting before. Actually, it was Mark that mentioned safety first. It would be good if we could, at the start of these meetings, really refer to safety, but I'm sure what you're doing, what you're saying, what you're doing. And finally, in terms of going forward, is there anything else you do think that you should do in this area?
I think the challenge on safety coming is in two areas. It is the transition in trial running to a operational railway, because when we are in trial running, we are actually running a railway, and we're working extensively with Mike's Health and Safety Director, the London Underground Safety Director. So collaborative working with TfL will be really important for when we transition into trial running, because it's a sensitive time. We've got to get that right. And the second thing is, as I mentioned to Caroline, we're working in some quite small corners of this big infrastructure now. So we are really going to focus on supervision, setting people to work with the right tools and the right planning, and minimizing change, which I think is, we can all recognize it in maybe our own homes. When you're doing that final small job, it's prone to change because something gets in the way. So there are two real focuses. Can we get the trial running absolutely at the highest possible standard? We will with our TfL and MTR colleagues. And can we really protect our workers and make sure they are as productive as they can be, although the work is very fine and quite challenging. And we've got good plans in both those areas.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Meggs mentioned morale of staff was high. How do you actually measure that?
I think that was me who said morale was high.
I agree with that.
I would say all of our tier ones measure their engagement at every site, and that's kind of how we know the health of the construction work. In our own organisation, what we've kind of committed to in the first quarter of next year within our organisation, because there's 1,100 people in Crossrail, is to sample exactly where they are, because 2020 will be a big year for Crossrail Limited. I'm confident we'll enter trial running, and to be honest, with the Christmas holiday coming, we've generally encouraged people to take more time off leading up to Christmas, because it'll be quite an intense and challenging year. So one of our big pivots will be towards the mental health and well-being of our staff. And in the first quarter of next year, Tony, we will be sampling and measuring that, and I'm quite happy to bring those results back.
Thank you, I'll leave it there.
Member Bailey on safety.
To what extent has the rush to be ready in time impacted your safety? Because I've worked on building sites, and when you're pressed to work quickly, that's when the mistakes are made.
So thanks, Sean. So every cut finger, every serious accident, every near miss gets investigated very, very thoroughly and presented to our board, presented to me. And in every single case, we've looked for this as a potential risk. It's an obvious risk, isn't it? Are we pushing too hard? And the truth is, in all of our investigation of when things have gone wrong or nearly gone wrong, we haven't detected rushing or pressure, interestingly. What we have detected is planning and unexpected change, which are, of course, closely related. That somebody aims today to adjust that CCTV camera, but when they get there, there's an electrician putting up the speaker of the PA system, so they've got to readjust their workload. So generally, we are, thankfully, and we're trying to create a culture of nothing will get in the way of safety. We will absolutely not tolerate the programme over safety, and that comes from the very, very top. What we've generally detected during the year is the inevitable consequence of a major project at the very end, particularly on this size, of localised change. People doing jobs that they, by necessity, are now having to adjust their workplace. And when we look at the coming year, a big focus on direct frontline supervision, the planning of work, the dynamic risk assessment at the absolute coalface is where we're going to be. But we haven't detected any sense of too much pressure from us or the tier ones, actually.
And you talked about the maturity of your risk management processes, and then we spoke about these 4 colleagues who tragically died of what, in the context of this conversation, seems to be the same issue. But that would suggest to me that you're not developing your risk management processes quick enough if you can have the same thing happen 4 times.
Well, I think, firstly, the tragic death of the 4 colleagues, in the evidence we have, we don't think it's related to the actual work at Bond Street. As tragic as it is, there's no actual evidence that happened because of the air quality of Bond Street. In fact, we've tested the air, and we don't really know why those individuals very sadly passed away. I would say, though, Sean, that don't forget, whilst Crossrail Limited's risk process was demobilised last year and we're building up, Costain Skanska joint venture at Bond Street have always been there with the highest standards of risk. So in terms of safety, I'm very confident in our tier ones that they didn't actually demobilise their risk management.
Okay.
The issues are really more in the guiding mind within Crossrail Limited, which is very important as a system integrator.
Can I just make, if I may, just a point of clarification here? When we're talking about our overall risk management system, it really is talking about sort of cost and schedule risk. It's not purely directed at safety. And
yeah.
So we identify safety risks. We've clearly identified safety risks and how those risks evolve. The other, when the PREP criticizes our risk management process, they're primarily referring to our ability to understand the risk of a cost overrun or the risk of a delay in the schedule.
So I'm talking about safety here, safety of workers
Right.
on your site. So you're suggesting that that part of your risk management is far more mature.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the demobilisation of Crossrail last year was mostly in the cost and schedule areas of risk. But there's no doubt that in the process, the general rising tide of our risk competency, we've improved in the our assessment of risk and safety. There's no doubt about that, which is a positive. But broadly, PREP are talking about, talking about cost and risk, and schedule.
Just one small question. So you now, with this big transition into the activation of the wire and the testing, you are comfortable with your safety mechanisms for taking on something new because your environment's about to change again. You've alluded to that. You are comfortable that you have the ability to do all that safety for the workers.
Very, very confident. We've got a big year ahead of us. The transition to trial running is a serious matter, but we've got the right team. It's a transition from one rule book to the other rule book. We had the ORR and HSE on a joint visit this week. We'll continue with that collaboration. We'll stay very close to TfL and MTR, and we're very confident. All I'm saying is we're taking it really seriously, and I'm sure our board would kind of expect this.
Yeah, I think just in terms of language here, I would never be comfortable around safety.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is one of the things that we advocate against.
Yeah.
Our biggest risk is complacency. We've actually, as a project, had quite a good track record overall around safety. Sadly, one fatality a number of years ago, but overall, and complacency is the thing. I know you didn't say that, but I just want to be clear. We absolutely have to think about this every single day and remind people every single day not to be comfortable with the safety performance or the safety risks on our project.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Just pick up one thing on the PREP, Assembly Member Prince, and then we'll move back.
Thank you. Just one other point, sorry, Chair. Mark, as you know, I've got a lot of time and respect for you. I've worked with you before. You were saying that your risk management, you believe, is now mature. I'm a bit concerned. Tony, you mentioned complacency or lack of... but I think there's maybe a lack of reality going on here. Not complacency, but lack of reality. Because if we look at the latest Jacobs report, it notes that risk management process is still relatively immature. Not mature, their words are immature, with a focus on risk accounting rather than the identification and management of the risks themselves. And they go on to say management bandwidth is limited and only a certain amount of issues can be resolved at once. So maybe you should sit down with Jacobs and have a conversation about why they think you're immature when you think you are mature.
Can I just make a point here? Because I think we're at risk of getting a little confused. We've got risk to do with safety and the physical and mental well-being of people. And then we have the risk management processes that, are on any major project are very sophisticated ways of understanding the risks to certain elements of the project. We need to distinguish between those two. I think what Mark said, if I heard him, is that we are mature in our understanding of safety risk. But in our in our ability in the managing of overall risk, having completely demobilized that part of the organization last year, prematurely, and having had to rebuild it from scratch, I think it would be fair to say, in my own experience, it's not the most mature risk management process we've ever had, but it is maturing all the time.
Okay. All right. Well, then my next question is about the PREP report, and I just suggested that maybe you should have a conversation with Jacobs, because in the PREP report for period 7, it suggests that there's been a reduced level of engagement and access to documentation for Jacobs, and I find that very worrying because we've been talking about transparency and improved transparency. So what reassurance can you give me and the committee that there will be more transparency and that you will make these documents available to Jacobs, and that you will instruct your teams to cooperate fully with Jacobs, because otherwise we're not going to pick up these things?
That's a really good question, Keith. So during the summer, we did get to a point when that was written when we kind of came separated a little bit at the very tactical level about PREP and our own teams. It was for a very brief period of time. It's a natural consequence of transparency, yet people driving to early dates. We, though, intervened, the PREP senior representative, myself, and I think if you ask them now, which I'd encourage you to do, we recalibrated that around September, October time, and the truth is PREP access all areas of Crossrail. They attend every single management meeting I have, and I've pushed right the way through the organisation, right to the front line, that PREP are to get every single document. I think, to be fair to the teams at the tactical front line, they're just getting on with doing the job. And myself and James Hampson, the PREP, I think now, if you ask them, we've turned that corner and we're back, at least for another for the previous 2 or 3 periods.
Perhaps we could ask them that then, can't we?
Just thinking we perhaps should write to the PREP, because you've given a name, James Hampson, because it's always redacted in anything online for some reason. But I think we'd like to, and maybe we might want to meet with the PREP next year.
Yes,
yeah.
I think I'd encourage.
I think, Chair, if I could, sorry, Keith, if I could just make one point which might help as well, is just to reassure you, through you, Chair, the committee, that I meet with the PREP coincident with every report being published, because the PREP actually is commissioned by the joint sponsors, ourselves and the DFT. So I meet with the PREP senior people every time with the CFO, and we go through it in quite a lot of granular detail, and inevitably have a conversation with Mark after those meetings to ensure, if you like, there is absolute clarity of anything that is being presented by the PREP, and that I think that Mark needs to make progress.
Mike, do you modify those reports before they go to the board?
Absolutely not, no, absolutely not. I mean, and in fact, when I attend every single Crossrail board at the end of those, at the end of the board, and the PREP is already in the room, and I know, as Tony, I think, alluded to earlier on, has played an active part in the full board discussion prior to me getting the update that I get at the end of every Crossrail board.
Thank you. Sorry, just one final point, and I just want to make the point, but I don't really necessarily need an answer. Just in that, also in that PREP report, it's on the safety, it's suggesting that the interventions made by Crossrail to improve safety performance are not flowing through to an improvement in results.
I've already
So that's their concern. You've given us answers to all those.
I think we have covered that. Caroline had already quoted that.
That's the point they're making.
But I think I'm reassured to hear that you, Commissioner, are challenging these reports, because obviously we get them a lot later. In fact, it only was published the end of last week. The last 2 we only had up until August. That was in I think the latest one, October's report, that said that relationship wasn't quite working. So if you're challenging that, I think that's a reassurance as well, as I'm sure others are too. Let's move on, just a quick bit on just Network Rail, where we are on that element, and then we'll move on to the next section. Caroline.
Yes, so this is looking at the Network Rail station enhancements, so things like the platform extensions, the new ticket halls, the step-free access, and also the work they're doing on the traction power upgrades. So how much is this package of outstanding Network Rail work going to cost, and how much has that increased since December 2018?
I can't talk for Network Rail on their costing. I do know there are cost pressures, but I can't talk to what their numbers are. I don't actually know them, and it's not really Crossrail Limited's imprimatur around their budget. That's handled by themselves with the Department for Transport. Our costs are capped in Crossrail at a certain level. So unfortunately, I don't know the numbers and I can't speak to them.
So the risk of cost overruns on that sits with...
Network Rail and DFT. Yeah.
Okay.
Outside of our ring fence, yeah.
Okay. And what risk do you think there is that Network Rail won't complete their work by the completion date?
Perhaps I could take that, if
Yes,
I may, because
yes.
it's probably more appropriate for me, because I actually meet with Andrew Haynes, the Chief Executive of Network Rail, every 4 weeks. And as you would expect, Crossrail, what we describe as on-network stations and infrastructure, is a key part of those discussions that I have with him. So just to give you some reassurance on Step 3, which is one of the issues that you raised, on the east, of course, we already have Meriden, Manor Park and Seven Kings. Those were actually works carried out by TfL. Ilford, which is a Network Rail station, work with a rebuild takes place during next year. On the west, Taplow got Step 3 yesterday. Hanwell, Ivor, Langley early in the new year. So there's a huge, and Ealing Broadway during 2020 as well. So there's a huge amount of progress. So again, we get very happy, Chair, to share this sort of granular update of Network Rail progress. But I certainly see, notwithstanding the cost pressures, which are real, as you alluded to and Mark alluded to, and that is a matter for the DFT to have further discussions, presumably with Treasury, to secure the necessary funding for the on-network works. But I see from my updates no material risk as to them not being able to fill what is required. And indeed, you will have noticed that as from the weekend, we started running the services to Reading out of Paddington on the east as part of what we currently call TfL Rail, with our staff on stations. And although there was a bit of a signal failure yesterday at Slough, everything was running on time this morning.
What about the electrification progress on that? Is that progressing in a way that you feel is going to be, fast enough?
I know a bit about that.
Yeah, sorry. Please, yep, of course.
You mean in the east? The east?
Yes.
So the Network Rail were considering whether the frequency of trains could be provided without completing all of the auto transformer electrification. That work isn't completed yet. I'll just reassure you, though, that if it isn't sufficient, we will ask it for it to be done. So they're modelling it as part of a value engineering to see if they could just not do the final bit of it because it was over-engineered. That modelling is still underway and not complete. So I think that's a fair question to hold and ask Andrew Haynes and DFT, actually. But
Maybe
they
we
won't.
write to Network Rail with some of this as
I think
well.
that might be a good idea. Yep.
They won't, but having spoken extensively to Network Rail, they won't take it out if they can't make it work. So I support them in doing the modelling so they don't waste money. And that isn't quite finished yet, I don't think.
And is there a problem with a sort of supply of engineers to be able to do that kind of work? I mean, do they have a pipeline
Mike would know
problem?
better than me. You have your dealings with Andrew Haynes?
They haven't mentioned any resource constraints on what they're planning to do. And I would just say, actually, that the leadership of Network Rail that Andrew Haynes has brought to this has actually really shone a spotlight of focus on this project. And I feel there is a spirit of collaboration and common cause that is really exactly what we need at this stage of the project.
Great, thank you.
Okay, lovely. Members, we've got 3 more sections to get through. Let's pick up a little bit of pace, though it is fascinating. I think we're all gripped and finding out the latest on this. Let's look at communication and transparency. We're picking up sections of our recommendations from our report. And Assembly Member Shah, you're going to open that.
Thank you, Chair. The report has very, very clearly defined a lot of serious concerns we've had with channels of communication and obviously resultant concerns about transparency. If I can start with Mr. Mayor and Deputy Mayor, how are you currently kept up to date on the progress on Crossrail, given that in the past, it was clear from the comments we've had that on your weekly reports, some of the risks, for example, were downplayed. Can you comment on what the current situation is?
Well, I'll ask Heidi and Mike to come in a second. I meet the Chair and Chief Executive every 6 weeks, roughly speaking. And I've been to 2 of their board meetings, I think one in September, one in November. The previous regime, there was no open invitation to go to their meetings, and it very was much, these are our toys, our trains, don't come near us. Very different atmosphere now. Separately, my Deputy Mayor, my Chief of Staff meet on a 2-weekly basis with Tony and Mark, and separately I receive dashboards. If you remember, the issue previously was the weekly reports, and so there's a balance between these guys giving us a whole wad of documents or TfL simplifying that into one, and so what we receive now is the same dashboards that are shared, and so we're looking at the same information, but I think it'd be worth Heidi and Mike talking about the changes they've seen. And also, Chair, in agreement with you, you're now written to, the Chair of the Transport Committee is written to regularly, and a number of other colleagues as well. Separately, I should add, before Mike comes in, the DfT have a similar candid relationship as joint sponsor with Crossrail Limited as well.
If you can pick up, you know, all the changes that have actually happened of late, please.
So I would say that the quality and the volume of information that I receive directly from Crossrail is in a completely different league to that which I received in the first 3 months of being in the job last summer. So as the Mayor has said, I meet on a fortnightly basis with Mark. The Mayor's Chief of Staff attends that meeting, Mike attends that meeting, sometimes Simon Killenback, the Chief Financial Officer, will also come, and equally the TfL board members, who are also part of the Crossrail board, are also invited to attend those meetings as well. At those meetings, I get to see the data on progress with software, on progress with getting all the bits of testing and sign-off done on whether it's the stations, the shafts, the portals, the track in the routeway, and that is the information that the executive team in Crossrail use and goes to Crossrail's board, and so I get the PREP reports at the point at which they are sent to the project, and then we have organised, as you will know, for those PREP reports to be published alongside the report that goes to the programme and investment committee, and so I'm not short of information, let's put it that way, about everything that is going on with Crossrail. And to be honest, the way I would characterise it is I don't think that there is more than 2 or 3 days that go by where I don't have a conversation with Mike about something in relation to Crossrail.
Perhaps I could just add, if I may, Chair, because there's a couple of additional things. So Tony and I talk every single week for a detailed run-through of issues that we think are useful for us to talk about. We do it every single week without fail. I talk to Mark at least once a week on an ongoing basis, often face-to-face, sometimes just catch up by phone. Mark already mentioned the visit last week from the Global Chief Executive Bombardier to the joint team at the Plateau, as it's called, at West Ferry Circus. Mark also mentioned the fact that at his invitation and at the Mayor's suggestion, I attended a meeting with Siemens out in Germany at their sort of factory. Now, that was really important. I'm not a signalling expert in the way that Mark is, but nonetheless, it was extraordinarily important to demonstrate how joined up and absolutely aligned we are in our approach to Siemens, and that worked really well as well. I've already alluded to the fact I meet with project representatives, senior people, as their report is published, and to review issues around that. In terms of within the core of TfL, we've had something called an Elizabeth Line readiness meeting. The new managing director of London Underground, who, as well as being an operator of considerable experience, is an engineer as well, has asked for a reconfiguration of that meeting to ensure that it is absolutely fit for the current phase of the project in terms of grabbing in the operation of the Elizabeth Line as it becomes commissioned, as it gets into the trial running phase and everything else. So there is a huge amount. I mean, I would say probably Crossrail occupies around about 25 to 30% of my time in support, of course, and not trying to do Mark's job for him, but in support of what Mark, Tony and the Crossrail board are doing.
Just one other thing, Chair, if I may. If you remember, you were concerned about 2 particular issues on the TfL board. One is, under the previous regime, Crossrail board, some things being discussed in part 2 in confidence, which meant the public was excluded. And secondly, the Crossrail as an item being discussed way down the agenda when members of the public may have lost the will to live. So we've done 2 things. Since Mark's been Chief Exec and Tony's been Chair, I can't remember an occasion I can't remember an occasion where we've needed to go into part 2, and that's a credit to the openness and transparency of the new team. And secondly, as you know, the Crossrail update follows immediately after the Commissioner's report, because I think it's important that we shine a light on Crossrail in the view of the public and Assembly members as well.
Mr. Mayor, therefore, you are able to confirm that you should not find yourself in a situation like what you were before, whereby you were not fully briefed in terms of either delays that may be in the pipeline or cost escalation, etc. You are absolutely given all the information well in advance so that you are not caught unawares and create further issues.
That's a really good question, Navin. So just give you a compare and contrast. It was only in August 2018 that Mike Hardy and I were told that Crossrail would open in December, four months in the future. That was the compare and contrast. In August, Mike attended a Crossrail limited meeting and was told there were concerns. There were new risks, new assurances in August. This is way in advance of Crossrail opening. In September, I attended the meeting, asked many questions, and Tony and Mark were very candid, as were other members of the board, saying, you know what, we need to do some further testing. We think we may not meet the 6-month window. We're not sure, though. We think we can do it. We're not sure. Can you give us 2 more months to come back with some answers to questions we've asked, the board has asked? And lo and behold, at the November board meeting, they were very, very candid, saying, although this is way in advance, it may not materialise. We may well meet the 6-month window. Because you want maximum transparency, you want a change of culture, we're notifying you we could miss the window, and you've seen a complete transformation. By the way, November 2019 is significantly more than 4 months in advance of central section opening. Why is that important? A, because we need the information, but if you're a business, or if you're a resident, if you're somebody who will benefit potentially from Crossrail, you need to know, because you've got to make plans. You need to mitigate, and so we're working together to make sure we can mitigate. And I should include as part of the equation, the DFT have been very collaborative and are also part of this new relationship as a joint sponsor with the new team at Crossrail.
Sounds like every part of this puzzle has kind of upped their game since what's happened. It's a different league. I mean, fortnightly, for you to be forensically going through stuff is quite extraordinary. I'm sure it's taking up more than 30% of your time, Heidi, at the moment. Assembly Member Bailey wanted to come in now.
Just address this to Mark and Tony initially. What good practices have you adopted to encourage a culture of transparency and openness across the whole organisation?
Well, I think that if I could just start that, I mean, we made, as Mark said, our stand right at the beginning of this year. This is kind of, after safety, this is our sort of working as one team and being open and transparent has been key. What happened last year, apart from anything else, was a disconnection between what was happening on the shop floor and what the executives may or may not have known. And we have worked very, very hard to join that up. So internally, the information that we're getting, that the Mark and the board are getting is reliable information straight from the stations using various systems that Mark has put in place. And externally, look, we can't tell anybody anymore. So we have created an environment where the expectation is that you will be open, you will be honest, you will be transparent. And I think that is just the culture that Mark and his team and the board have created. I would say, it comes at a cost. I've worked on many projects in the public sector and the private sector. And what you want to do in a project is you want to create a little bit of a pressure cooker, especially when you're trying to get it finished. And if every wart and wrinkle has to be, and is actually, exposed, you know more about this project than I do, or as much. In maintaining that kind of pressure cooker, and maybe that's the wrong term, but maintaining that sort of degree of so it comes, it's the right thing to do. We're proud of the way that we have opened our soul and our window to the world. but it comes at a little bit of a cost. And when the board is thinking, as it is now, about windows and how we're going to revise those windows, we have to bear in mind two considerations. You know, we're slightly between a rock and a hard place here. We want aggressive targets to drive performance within the project with our contractors and so on, but we don't want to let anybody down. So on the one hand, we'd like to be super conservative. On the other hand, we'd like to be very optimistic. That's why we have a window, and that's why a lot of deliberation goes into how to set that window to achieve all of these objectives. It's actually quite hard to do, to be frank with you, but that's...
So, Mark, do you think these systems are working? How do you test them? Because, of course, there was massive failures beforehand, and we need to be reassured that you have made a change. Listening to the conversation, it feels like it is. I don't believe this level of conversation could have gone on before. But there was such a big failing. We've talked at length. Did the mayor know? What did he know? Why didn't he know? How are you testing these systems? How can you reassure Londoners that there is words from the very coalface, from those electricians right up to the chair?
Well, I think the proof's in the pudding, really. We have metrics now of everything left to do in this job, and there's still, I can't put a number on it, but there'll be more than 15,000 tasks still to do on Crossrail. Some of them quite minor, some of them are major. We've spent a lot of time cleansing the data. PREP have actually looked at it. PREP have audited. We've also put our own second line of assurance in that's done target assurance on our data. And I think we've come a long way, actually, in the granularity of understanding where we are. The challenge then is, okay, what's the future going to be? How many of those widgets will you get done? I still think that's a challenge for us to define our outcome, because the productivity is a challenge on this job. But I think we're very confident in our data set now. And it's actually very helpful for the management team to be allowed to be so transparent. And we get scrutiny, and it's quite tough, but nobody's really complaining about it, because we're kind of all in it together. So.
I think this three lines of assurance, which is, you know, the sort of top quality project management, we have put in place this year. And not only have we put in 3 independent, so that means that we have, you know, people at the front line, obviously doing assurance and using the right professional qualifications and right standards and so on. Then we have people at the second line who are independent of us, sort of looking at that and making sure that those systems are good. And then we have people in the third line, which are even more independent, for example, our independent expert advisory panel. And then, you know, just to make darn sure, the IPA, a fantastic institution, came in a few weeks ago and checked that our assurance system, that 3-layer system, was actually effective, and have made some recommendations as to how we can improve it. It is hard to imagine more scrutiny.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, can you remind us how regularly you see these dashboards?
Every 2 weeks or every week. I see them every 2 weeks, but they could come to us every week, I'm not sure, but I see them every 2 weeks.
Who prepares your dashboard?
Sorry?
Who prepares the dashboard?
I think
these guys. We do.
Okay.
And there's one dashboard for everybody.
Yeah.
There's no, we just don't filter it. There isn't like a mayor's dashboard and a assembly dashboard. We just create the vanilla truth. And then
it's just data. It's not interpretation. It's data.
I mean, to be fair, more useful than the dashboards are the face-to-face, because I can then ask the questions. The sort of questions you're asking, I can ask that face-to-face, because the dashboard is a one-way.
I understand. I asked because one of the major criticisms and one of the real cultural breakdowns was the difference between the filter, let's call it the filter, between what was being said at one place and what was being delivered to another. Crossrail's take on going on, TfL's take on what's going on, caused much confusion. I'd ask you directly, Mike, where are you in this new culture? How are you contributing, to this new culture? Is there anything that you think that you could be doing more of?
Well, no, other than spending 100% on the project, but actually I do have to give Mark a little bit of capacity to deliver the damn thing, if I may. But actually, I think one of the things that it is a relevant point here, because it's a very well made point, and Tony's talked about 3 layers of assurance, Sean, and how important that is. Just at a very granular level, one of the questions that I asked both the P-Rep, the project representative, and then I asked Mark, was whether there was any risk that somehow false positives were being communicated. So actually there was some greens on the dashboard, if you like, that weren't real greens based on the evidence actually at the ground of what was going on. And the P-Rep gave me a very categoric assurance that they didn't think that was the case, and they'd done quite a lot of digging and probing into that. I asked Mark, did I not? Exactly the same question, and Mark also did that, because there is always a risk in these projects that something emerges that people kind of become sort of convinced is the reality when it isn't the reality on the ground. But I do think the processes that Mark's put in place in terms of the what you might call production control, the control schedule, the visualization process of having a very robust reporting mechanism, again, which the Mayor and Heidi and I attended down at the offices at Stratford, demonstrates that this is real. These dashboards are reflecting the reality reported from Crossrail, but you will understand why I've asked for just some additional reassurance as to the validity of them.
Can I add a small sort of thing, which is, each of us as non-executive directors at Crossrail have sort of taken on a station or to sort of sponsor. And I, for example, spend a day every month hanging out at Liverpool Street. And I go to every one of their meetings. I go down into the station. All of my colleagues do the same. I'm not, special. And we look at what's really actually going on. And you cannot get closer to the action to have your non-executive directors on the board regularly visiting and interacting with sites that they get to know and actually strangely love.
While that's very useful and signals some change, listening to Mark speak when he came onto the project, there was utter horror being hidden and nobody could see that. And unless you're an expert, again, Mark talked about these being very exciting edifices. You look at Bond Street, for instance, looks great, but behind the scenes, there's an awful lot to do, which needs an expert eye. That's about culture, that's about understanding. So I do take your point that attending is very important, and it sends a message to everybody that we're in this together. But I'm very interested in making sure that the detail is there, the reality is there. We had a long conversation in the press, in this room, in our report about what the Mayor did or didn't know, and it's very opaque. And if we're going to get past that point and believe that your risk register and what you tell us is going to happen for a delivery date, we have to understand that there's a change in culture. I tell you this because many years ago, I spoke to an ordinary guy working across Crossrail, where I get on because I use a Shenfield light. He told me it wasn't going to be ready in time, but yet nobody bothered to tell us. And I hope that the different feeling in this meeting is correct, but I'm very interested in the actual culture change. What questions are you asking and who can you ask? Will this line be ready?
Oh, for goodness sake.
Let's start.
Okay, just briefly, and then we'll move on to the next bit.
It starts at the top, and we have adopted that spirit of transparency. We ordered it, and we're going to keep going with it.
Yeah, we've got a section on corporate culture at the end, so let's pause that there. That's great, thank you. Let's move on to Assembly Member Cooper. You've got the rest of these questions.
Thank you. Obviously, there's been huge public interest, not just because of the level of public resources going into the project, but also because of the impact on people's lives, which the Mayor referred to, hopefully positive, finally, when it all gets opened. So it's encouraging to hear that you're discussing communication and improvements that have been made. And Deputy Mayor Alexander said since last summer there are distinct improvements. But one of the things in the report that the Transport Committee did was also about transparency. And Assembly Member Shah referred to the period of time when we seem to be having a bit of many a slip twixt cup and lip, and it seemed to be a bit obscure as to who was saying what, where to who and when. So one of the things that was a recommendation was that the Crossrail board meetings should be made fully public. Is that something that's going to happen?
Let me address that because that is the one recommendation that we looked hard at and frankly didn't accept. And the reason for that is, unlike, for example, the board of TfL, which is looking over a vast array of public services, we are focused on a very, very specific project. Our board meetings are working meetings. They contain, a huge amount of commercial and commercially sensitive information. We publish very extensive minutes. We try and reduce the reductions to the minimum possible. It is my, professional opinion as the chair that it would be impossible for us to conduct the kind of meetings that we have, which are very open, very candid, very direct.
What are the kind of things then that you're still saying that need to be kept commercially in confidence? I think most of the people in this room, we're being webcast now. Most of our proceedings are completely in public. Lots of people around the table have previously been councillors and have part of a meeting that is then done, in camera, in private. I don't understand why you can't restrain the elements that are commercially confidential. The project is underway. It's not as though we're talking about people bidding for new contracts and bidding against each other and the pricing is confidential. It seems unreasonable that most of it, absolutely, the vast majority could not be in public. And yes, my question was addressed to you. That's why I looked at you as I asked.
Well, I'm afraid we're just going to have to respectfully, hopefully respectfully disagree. I just believe that the quality of the conversation that we have, the type of conversation that we have, would be very, very difficult indeed if it were to be done on camera.
Or give me an example that would be awkward.
Well, I actually think it's an overall kind of tonal thing. But yes, I mean, we are dealing with 40 or 50 different contractors here. A lot of our conversations have to do with individual contractors or groups of contractors. And I believe what would happen, is that more and more of the board meeting would be squeezed into a private session, which I believe, has happened in the past.
We're pretty well aware that this is a complex project with an awful lot of complexity attached to it. But you'll also understand that both this committee and also members of the public across London have seen delays and also have felt that there's been a lack of transparency. That's why I'm asking this question.
I think it would be wrong to say there's been a lack of transparency. It would be impossible for us to provide any more information.
I think that's what people feel.
I regret that, but there is an enormous amount of information available about this project. And I do not think, genuinely do not think, the public interest would be served, or the interest of getting this project served, by having our board meetings held. And I just don't think it would be in anybody's interest. It may,
Okay, I think I probably pressed you as far as we can go on that. You talked about the minutes being published, and the Mayor responded to a question in Mayor's Question Time in May of this year, saying that he felt having minutes published was a good thing. Obviously, having minutes then published in a timely fashion is something that we are pretty keen to see. Do you think that 2 months from the time of a meeting to the minutes coming out is actually a timely fashion in any size, shape or form? Could they not be produced more quickly?
Well, I have pressed quite hard on this, and I would like them to be done more quickly. But right now, they are quite extensive minutes. We have quite a few committees. We have a very small staff looking after the boards, I would say, and the board and the board committees. And so the process is that the minutes are reviewed and confirmed or agreed upon at the subsequent meeting. So if we have a November board, then the minutes are reviewed by the board in December, and then they have to be scrutinised for redaction, and that is done actually by ourselves and also in consultation with our sponsors, and that just takes a little time. But I have looked at it. We've moved it from 3 months to 2. I'm happy to see if we can do better.
And get away with reviewing minutes.
I think it would be very helpful if it could be sooner rather than later. I think it's been exacerbated for us by, and perhaps this is one for Mark to comment on, the Transport Committee has been informed on progress through monthly updates, and the first few of those in May, June and July came through on time as expected, but August was late, September was late, October was late, November was late, and I think we've just received the update, almost on time, but not quite, for December. Now, I think, again, and it is because there have been these issues. That's why I'm pressing you particularly on this. I do understand the organisational constraints, but, public confidence in this project is crucial.
So we had not had a good record of producing the monthly update on time. So my commitment is next year everyone's going to be on time. I guarantee you. Because we've got
a lot of people have just heard you say that both in the room and on the webcast.
No, I can guarantee it'll be there because I'll make sure it happens.
I think that would be very helpful. One of the things
Can I just, make a remark to clarify from a comment over here?
He's always heckling, don't worry. He doesn't
I'm not heckling. We could not get away with it.
No, when I said obviously the minutes are the boards, the board writes the minutes, or the secretariat writes the minutes, the board approves the minutes. So the only bit that gets other scrutiny, there's no change to those minutes made by anybody. The only bit that gets scrutiny is redaction, to make sure that nobody is being compromised or commercially. That's all. I just, because I think I misled you, or you may have been misunderstood.
Review is not a good word. Review is a synonym for revise.
The minutes are not revised by anybody except myself or members of the board.
Thank you for that clarification.
I review the transcript of all the meetings that I chair, Tony, and I can tell you it's quite a lengthy process, but it doesn't necessarily mean revised. It doesn't mean review. My final question, I think it's really important that we're talking about this because it's just as important for us to know that the public are assured, that we are assured, but also that the correct information is coming to the Mayor and Deputy Mayor from Crossrail, and getting all of that properly transparent and good communication as part of that is really important to us. My final point is about the public engagement side, and you have apparently been producing some videos which you've been putting up on the website to try and improve people's understanding of the complexity of what is actually being done at individual stations and on the project as a whole. I just wondered if you could set out for us the impact of these videos in terms of public engagement. How many people have looked at them? Have you had comments back on them? Has it been useful?
Yeah, so when we inherited the project, or we were asked to take the project over a year ago, we had no media team at all, really. We had some good people, but the media team, that was quite a machine on Crossrail, has been demobilised. In the course of the year, we've re-recruited a small team, but a very capable and competent one. And we would see one of our main objectives is to educate people on why these delays and why do we have such uncertainty. So we've got a series of films. We do a quarterly update. The next one will be in January, I think. And the reach is quite extensive. I posted one on my LinkedIn profile just a month ago, and I got 100,000 views. There's a great appetite and interest in this project, and we're going to keep going with that. We've appointed a new communications director, Alex Kaufman, and she'll be leading quite an extensive program of again, it's back to the transparency, but we would say it's an essential thing to educate why this is a complicated job, and any feedback people have, just drop me a line, whether it's you have more or less. But I think we've made a big progress in the year in terms of our communication.
Thank you, Chair. I'm finished.
No, thank you. I just wanted to make a point before I bring in Assembly Member Devonish. In terms of public engagement and reputation of the project, you've got to be a good neighbour, and there are issues, I know, on Network Rail End out in Abbeywood, which the Crossrail Complaints Commissioner is involved in, but there's also issues which Mark is very well aware of about businesses like the London Gin Club in Soho closed for 10 months as a result of contractors from Crossrail. And there's issues because everyone hides behind insurers, loss adjusters, and actually this is a business unable to survive at the moment, unable to operate. And I know Mark is dealing with it, but I would just urge you all, in with your different hats on, to see what you can do to get liability sorted here and the work's done so this business can open, and there may well be others, I'm sure, as well, but this one I particularly know about. It's your reputation as a project as well.
Chair, if I may, Mark and I have talked about that just actually even in the last 10 days, and we've just agreed a sort of further course of action to try and do exactly as you suggest. So,
so perhaps you could write to me outside this. I just wanted to put on record because I think they have been in the press as well.
It's very important, and we've talked.
It is because reputationally, project has generally worked well with neighbours. I just want to make sure that continues. Assemblymember Devonish, you wanted to come in here.
I wanted to, for really the first time ever, agree 100% with A.M. Cooper on what she said, and I would like to raise to the Mayor...
To happen sooner or later, Tony.
Indeed. So I had to raise with the Mayor and the Commissioner a culture point, really, because I think we can all agree that TfL's culture is not the most transparent. We need to always try and improve as we go forward. And can I particularly make the point to Mr. Meggs that part of the feedback in communication in terms of specialist, expert feedback on the communication hoop, really, in terms of freedom of information, is that if you have part of your meetings in public, not the whole meeting, of course, for commercial reasons, we do this with Westminster Council with planning meetings, if most of the meeting is in public and hundreds literally of specialists watch this, sometimes they will come up with an idea better, dare I say it, than anybody in Crossrail or TfL. So can I urge the Mayor and the Commissioner to go away and think about what A.M. Cooper has said, which I agree with 100%, and reflect on that, because I do think that TfL and Crossrail will be a better organisation if you do open up further, please.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that point. We'll put that in correspondence as well following this meeting. Let's move on to looking at governance and assessment of risk. Assemblymember Copley.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, our report made, I think, 3 recommendations in relation to governance and assessment of risk. If I could start with Tony first, and then maybe ask the Mayor, Deputy Mayor and Mike to comment. Can I ask how you've taken our report's recommendations around governance on board?
Well, let me make sure I find the right page.
No problem.
But broadly, without referring to the specifics, we have really transformed the governance of Crossrail over the last sort of 11, 12 months in the following way. First of all, we've got essentially a new board. So we have expanded the board to bring in a little bit more expertise. But everybody on our board, with one exception, has been on the board only since the middle of last year. We've brought in several new this year. Secondly, and the purpose of that is to make sure we have the right skills, but to also make sure we have the right level of challenge. So these are new fresh eyes on the project. And the second thing that we've done is we've put in place the 3 lines of assurance, which is best practice. It wasn't in place before. So that's the technical and commercial people on the ground, then people looking at the system, and then people above that. The third thing we've done is either set up or reinvigorated the committees that either were in place or should have been in place before. So we have now an audit and assurance committee. We have an investment committee, which we took over from the executive, and we run it at the board level. And we have a nominations and nominations and remuneration committee. So those are now all fully effective. And then finally, I mean, we have opened up in terms of our governance. We have opened ourselves to a lot of external scrutiny, and we are communicating widely on the progress of the project, the problems of the project, etc. So I think we have responded very positively, not just to your recommendations, but to the numerous recommendations made by KPMG at the beginning of the year, and to numerous interactions with our sponsors in particular, who have assiduously followed up actually on every single recommendation to make sure that we're running the company in the best way we can.
And yes, and of course the recreation of all the Audit and Assurance Committee was one of our recommendations. So this board, do you think it's providing more challenge to management than the previous board was? And perhaps Mark can comment on that, because of course you are the board member that's been on.
Yeah, I would say it's a completely different situation. I think the executive team get a lot of constructive challenge. Actually, the board's very comprehensive now in its skill set. It's got a very, individuals who've got great experience of doing these works in different genres, and yeah, we get a lot of challenge. The board previously, I don't particularly want to talk about it really. It's not really what I'm here for, but we're in a totally different league of where we are, and I really value the board. Actually, I think they've really helped us, and it's not entirely a comfortable situation sometimes, but the scrutiny's been good.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And Sadiq, Heidi, Mike, do you want to comment on these recommendations?
Just say a couple. Add a couple of things. First of all, when I go to the end of the Crossrail board as the senior sponsor, alongside either the permanent secretary of the DFT or one of our senior director general staff, what I find really encouraging is the chair, Tony, gives an update first of all on where the discussions have gone. But then, I think very importantly, he calls on every single member of the board to give their own assessment of the issues that have been discussed at the board and their perspective. And those are slightly different perspectives because they come from an area of different specialities, different areas of focus. Some of them sit on the Audit and Assurance Committee, for example, or even chair it. Some of them sit on the safety leadership group. Wherever they sit, they come from that different perspective. And I find that extraordinarily rich and valuable in getting that wide perspective. And there's no sense, by the way, of Tony sort of leaping in and cutting them short in their opinions or in their perspectives. It's absolutely open. And then Mark gives his perspective at the end of that list of non-exec directors as well. I think in terms of other things on governance more generally, if I could just give some further updates on the recommendation of this committee. So the assignment of lead ownership and strategic risks relating to the opening of the line from a TfL perspective, that's been allocated specifically to the Managing Director of London Underground, and I discuss that in my regularly monthly executive committee meetings with my executive colleagues at TfL. We've had a coordinated strategic workshop between Crossrail Limited, Network Rail and Transport for London to ensure a common understanding of the risks to completion and interdependencies in that process. We've given further consideration for the arrangements for the practical and operations handover from stations and infrastructure into TfL asset ownership and maintenance and management. We've given further strengthening of the management oversight of the preparations for the handover and operational readiness within Transport for London for the Elizabeth line. And the fact that Crossrail has reviewed the capacity and capability across its programme overall, establishing a systems integration team to ensure greater transparency and openness with us as to what happens there. The visual management process, which I talked about before, actually originated when Mark was in London Underground, even before Mark was in London Underground, and is a direct lift across as a process which really demonstrates real openness and proper dialogue within the team. And as Mark said, colleagues from my team attend those meetings along with MTR and other key people. So I think we've not only did we sort of take very seriously that recommendation that this committee made, a very helpful recommendation, but I think we've continued to evolve the thinking behind that recommendation even as recently as the last few weeks.
Well, thank you for that. That's very comprehensive, and we also recommended keeping governance structures periodically under review as the project moves into different phases. Is that something you're doing to make sure that the governance is right for the particular stage of the project?
Well, absolutely, and I do think, I don't want to sort of overplay him because he's only been here 4 or 5 weeks, but the new managing director of London Underground is definitely, the earliest discussions I've had with him is about him seeking to pull this project in to TfL core, and that is, now that we've got somebody permanent in that position, is a real further step change, I think, given the stage of the project of where it is. And we've talked quite a lot about trial running and that phase. It's really, really important and an imperative that as stations get ready to be handed over, that we properly review the effective moment for handover. Some of that handover may be still with some snagging items that might be better placed for the TfL teams, the London Underground teams, to actually pick up and deliver, and allow Mark and the team to focus on getting the routeway and the trial running processes in place without being distracted with some of these continuing risks. We've got to work out how the money transfer and the commercial issues sit with that, but I really do get the sense, and I'm sure Mark could echo this, that Andy Lord in London Underground is very, very, he sees this as his railway that Mark happens to be building for him, which I think is exactly the right approach.
Thank you. Finally, just back to Tony and Mark, is there any element remaining of the governance structure of Crossrail that you feel needs to change?
Well, there's always room for improvement. And in fact, right now, we have commissioned a review of the board and actually an independent, assessment of how it's doing. And that isn't really just the board, it's the board and all its committees, and effectively it's a governance review that's been undertaken.
Who's conducting that
I can't remember. It's an independent contractor that we brought in from the outside that specialises in that. They will report back to the board during January, and in February we will decide what to do with their recommendations. I mean, one of the comments that they have made already is that, and by the way, I'm not overseeing this because it needs to be properly independent. It's being done by one of our senior independent directors. But one of the comments that they've made is that this process of kind of wrapping up at the end of the board meeting with our sponsors, they've never seen before. They think it's a sort of, well, first of all, they wonder how the chairman can actually focus on doing that, and I say I don't really focus on it, it just happens. But secondly, they think it might be a bit of best practice that they might want to use elsewhere or recommend elsewhere.
Excellent. Okay, unless there's any further comments on governance, I'm happy to leave it. And yes.
I want to ask about the role of the project representative, if I can. They were originally set up on the old structure to be an independent voice to give advice to the sponsor board, and that advice was then allowed the sponsor board to challenge the Crossrail board. For example, KPMG in their report earlier this year stated that although the project representative had highlighted risk, that wasn't taken on board by the Crossrail board. And they also mentioned that the terms of risk were extremely vague and that there was no actions for the sponsor board to be able to then take to the Crossrail board and challenge. Has the tone of that advice to the sponsor board changed? And I noticed from the Mayor's response to our report that it stated that resources had been enhanced for the project representative. So I was just wondering if you could tell us about those and how that advice has changed and the tenor of it and what you do with it.
Well, I think it's the latter 2 points, really. It's the tenor of what we do with it, to be honest, Joanne, because I think where we were before was, I think issues were being highlighted at the sponsor board, but the sponsor board was finding it extraordinarily difficult to get any traction with the Crossrail board in its previous incarnation. So issues were being raised, and to be honest, to some extent were being dismissed as being alarmist or inappropriate or ill-advised or ill-thought through. I think the difference now, and I alluded to it earlier on, Chair, through you, that the discussions that I now have with the project representative directly, where they are able to give some context around the reports that they are producing now, the fact that these go to the Crossrail executive team and indeed to the Crossrail board and are given proper airtime, proper consideration. The fact, as I said, that when I walk into the Crossrail board at the end of its meeting, the project representative has already been there and has sat through the deliberations and the review and the discussions within the Crossrail board. This is an entirely different relationship. They never got anywhere near the previous board in terms of being able to directly communicate the issues, and frankly, that is why I've been very keen to ensure that I have a proper effective meeting with them alongside the CFO before every Crossrail board, so that we have this absolutely collective common perspective of the issues they're raising. And sometimes there are points of clarification. You just need to ask them, did you, so for example, picking up the point that was raised earlier on about risk, is it a safety risk you're talking about, or is it an overall financial project delivery risk that's being discussed? And I think those are the types of things that often you need to have a conversation with. So it's an entirely different tenor, entirely different way of dealing with it, and the project representative is hugely important, not just to sponsors, ourselves and the DFT, but I know also to the delivery team.
And the extra resources that have been put into the project representative team, what do they consist of?
Well, so the project representative is the person that was Mark alluded to, whose name had been not revealed before, but he is a very senior, very competent project delivery person within the Jacobs team. He's extraordinarily well thought of within the industry, and he has got all resources at his disposal from within Jacobs to enable them to do the job. So, in fact, I did ask him at our last meeting, did he have enough resources to ensure this was that he was doing what he needed to do. And I think if you look at the comprehensive nature of their reports, it is demonstrating that level of competence.
Heidi.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that those PREP reports also come to the Programme and Investment Committee of TfL Board. I think I referred to it earlier, but it does enable then the members of the TfL Programme and Investment Committee to have a huge amount of very rich information to draw upon to ask their own questions, and Mark comes along to those meetings of the Programme and Investment Committee, and so I think that the fact that it's shared more widely as well now is actually a really positive thing.
And I take it, as far as Tony and Mark are concerned, that's actually been very useful for you to have that more detailed scrutiny, if you like.
We, you know, it's my observation that the better the project team, the more they invite and welcome scrutiny. And one of the things about this team is that they welcome and invite scrutiny because even if it's not always comfortable, it provides opportunities for improvement. You know, I didn't think they could do a better job.
And Mark, when you're assessing risk, the advice or the comments that the project representative gives to you, can I ask, are you always in agreement and do you adjust, or are there some issues where you are not? And if you are not, then what steps are you taking to ensure that as that issue progresses, you are reviewing and checking back?
So we haven't done this, maybe we should do this. If we did look back at the project representatives' reports, there would be 10 to 12 instances where their ideas have actually prompted executive action. I think we could definitely evidence a case where the project representatives have pointed us to an area and we've improved on it. Generally, our disagreements with the project representatives are more at a very tactical layer, probably station by station. I don't think there's any disconnect actually in the, I'm sure they would say this actually, that there is very little disconnect now between ourselves and the project representative on the strategy. We of course have disagreements if they disagree with something at Farringdon Station, and what happens is the project representative comes to every single meeting I have, and we always give the project representative airtime to challenge us. And that's a really big change actually. That when I was on the board of Crossrail previously, the project representative didn't have the access that they have now, and they are right through the organisation. And I think we found it very valuable, probably a best practice.
I just would add one, it's not a caveat, but just to say their job is to identify all the things that might go wrong or could go wrong or are going wrong, not to talk about all the really great things that are happening.
Absolutely.
And therefore, you know, I suppose that's our job, but it is a particular perspective on the project.
And then in the Mayor's response to our report, we were told that the sponsors have appointed a technical advisor to provide insight on railway systems delivery. And I was just wondering where that technical advisor sat, who they advised and what use that had been.
I've got that. So this is a big move forward in the project that previously, I think in the NAO report, your report, and maybe it's KPMG, the lack of competency and capability of the project representatives for the challenge ahead was cited. They've appointed a very notable person who joins the sponsor board, somebody we've worked with for many, many years with great experience in railway systems. We had the sponsor board last week, and this person was a very active participant in it. That person's going to come with us to the Romford Control Centre actually early in the new year. So this person actually advises the sponsor board and the project representative, but it's been a really big move forward actually.
Okay, thank you. And my last question then is to the Mayor and Deputy Mayor, and that is that there's obviously been a lot of learning in this project, and we're all familiar with when the next project comes along, a lot of that institutional learning has been lost. So I'm just asking, what are you planning to do with regards to this project to actually write up the lesson so that when we get Crossrail 2, you know, there is a reference document to look back on and to say, actually, this is the way you go about doing this. Obviously, things change. It'll be a different world we're living in. But there will be lessons that we can learn from this that should be applied elsewhere.
I mean, just to say, I mean, it's worth reminding ourselves that the precedent used for Crossrail was HS1 and the Olympics, independent body given the autonomy and responsibility to get the thing built. And it worked in the past, and actually until relatively recently, it appeared to be working now. What's clear is that as the clients, and that's what the sponsors are, the DFT and the TfL are the clients, there wasn't the level of control or levers that there should have been. And there's many lessons we've learned. The NA report that Mark referred to is very good. Actually, I say this not to spare the blushes of the Assembly, but the Transport Committee report was very good. So I think there's now an evidence based in relation to improvements that can be made, and we are now putting into practice many of these improvements going forward. And you're right, there are some, hopefully we'll have further infrastructure where there'll be a role for an autonomous, independent body. One thing I'd say is this, though, and neither Mark or Tony have said this, and I'm really pleased they haven't. The balance we've got to strike is allowing the professionals to get on with the job, having a light touch, you know, accountability, but bearing in mind this is a huge amount of taxpayers' money from businesses, so they demand scrutiny, regular updates, and almost watching during the course of the work being done, which is, Tony's got huge experience, and in Tony's experience, never before has he seen a project like this. And as I said to the board when I went to address them in September, well, I'm afraid that's part and parcel of, you know, spending a huge amount of money building an amazing Elizabeth line. So there's a lot we've learned, Joanne, and I'm hoping that the most important thing is it's possible for a government of one political persuasion to work closely with a regional government of another. It bodes well for Greater Manchester in relation to HS3. It bodes well in relation to some of the exciting plans they've got in the North East and North West. And so, you know, Mike and I are always keen to make sure we have the institutional learning passed on. And one of the things we're doing going forward is making sure that when it comes to lobbying the government for investment in infrastructure in London, they've got confidence that actually we've got a track record of delivering. I accept the point, you know, additional expenditure and delay. All I'd say, you know, is to put it in context of what's gone on around the world with other major infrastructure projects, in the context of in 2010 a decision was made to reduce in billions the cost of Crossrail, and arguably we're now going back to the original quote for Crossrail. But my concern is the businesses and residents who were expecting this to open in December 2018 and haven't. So lots and lots of lessons that have been learned, and we'll make sure going forward they're used in future projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one additional point I would make is that, you know, there are a lot of hard yards still to go with the delivery of the central section, and what we haven't talked about as yet today, and I don't know whether the committee will be coming on to it, is that, you know, stages 4 and 5, when you connect the central section out to the services that are now running from Paddington to Reading and out from Liverpool Street, that's going to be a very complex piece of work as well. And I think the mistake of the previous regime was to start talking about the legacy and all the things they learned during the civil engineering project, and actually did lose sight of the reality that was confronting them at that point in time. And so whilst I think it is really important that we, you know, reflect and capture the things we have learned about the process over the last 18 months, let's not forget the fact that we've got a real job of work to do to get this whole new railway open. And so we need to do that point of work at an appropriate point in time.
May I to add to Ivy's, both those excellent points. I think we have, you know, 650 sort of commercial technical papers out there from the past, which are widely referenced around the world when people start up new projects. We have reinitiated, Mark and myself, that sort of learning legacy, as it is called, so that we can capture this next set of lessons, sort of detailed lessons that come from what we're doing right now. And I think they'll be extraordinarily valuable, possibly more valuable than the ones we had before.
Yep.
I mean, for me, there are 3 big lessons to take away from this. There are many, but 3 big ones. Simplify. This project is too complicated. Simplify, simplify, standardize. The second is all projects now are systems integration projects, and they ought to be owned and run really by systems integration people from the get-go. And the third thing is that you know, deadlines are important, but beware, because they can cause sort of anomalous behavior, let me just put it that way. But there are many lessons to learn, and we are actually capturing those as we go along now.
That's very helpful, and I have met with the Chief Exec of High Speed too to go through our recommendations and to challenge him and his organisation to learn from some of the things we've picked up. So I have been trying to do that with our work as well. Assemblymember Berry wanted to come in on this, and then we're moving to the final shorter section.
Yes, some of the questions I wanted to ask have been covered already, but just in terms of our own scrutiny, obviously I'm here today, I'm not a member of the Transport Committee. We've had a number of special meetings about this. Is there a case for us continuing to have some kind of working group or something that meets quarterly? Obviously we've got changes to our own structures, so this might be for discussion outside, but also just to say that we should be doing this for any big project, I would have thought, in advance.
Well, I think that's something for us to look at wider as an assembly, but I think Transport Committee will be wanting to look at this, and also some of the things, whether it's meeting the P-Rep in public or having a briefing to then feed into one of these. But I think that's something to take outside.
Yeah, where things get really major, I think. Like with, we've had a Brexit committee, for example, and part of the reason I'm here is the budget and performance. Sorry?
Not anymore.
Okay, let's not get into that now, please, members.
Sorry.
Is there any
Hector
question for our
he
guests?
does it all the time.
We can
We thought we experienced
take
you
that
better behave.
outside.
Yeah, just also, so a question to the Mayor, as well. On a similar note, obviously, I mean, we're presumably not planning to bid for the Olympics again, but there are other projects outside of transport where this might be borne in mind as in terms of transparency, in terms of the governance, in terms of those kinds of things. So as Mayor, are you making sure this goes outside of the transport bubble in terms of how projects are planned and things? The only equivalent I thought of is the Olympics, possibly the mayoral development corporations, where we've had trouble with scrutiny, and some of these transparency and honesty and whatever warts and all kind of lessons might be well learnt in other areas of governing London.
Well, of course, in transport, we hope to be successful with Crossrail too, and it'll be important we learn the lessons. The Chair mentioned high speed too, but I think Crossrail too also is something we could make sure these lessons are learned. Next year we're hosting the Euro 2020s, which we're not building stadia for the Euro 2020s, but arguably the biggest sporting event in our city. Well, it is since the Olympics 2012. So how you manage people and all sorts of working relations with other parts of the London family is really, really important. But we've made sure that the institution that is City Hall has learnt all the lessons for this, and whenever there's any big infrastructure projects or any big projects, we understand the need for scrutiny. Actually, the Olympics, one of the things that the Public Accounts Committee did, I know as a former member of the Public Accounts Committee, looked in real time at the cost of the Olympics. So rather than after the project was finished, looking back at any issues, did it in real time. And I think one of the things, Chair, we could be thinking about doing, you could be thinking about doing as an assembly, as a reference to what Sian said, was thinking about how when it comes to real-time scrutiny. And again, Chair, I make the offer I made last time. I'm really happy for us to come back again in 6 months' time to give more information, to answer questions, because I think it's important we do so, and I think it's important Londoners get the information that you elicit through this conversation.
I think next year it would be very useful for the new Transport Committee to hear from you at the right moment, whether it's in the autumn, maybe next year. But I think that would be very, very helpful. Thank you. Let's move on to the final section. We've covered a few bits of it, but leadership and corporate culture. Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. I mean, obviously the problem being the tail end, Charlie, is that most people have walked all across your pitch. But anyway, I'm going to ask the question, Mark, but I think you've pretty much covered it. So if there's just anything you want to add to what you've already said, rather than repeat what you said. You said previously that undue optimism that occurred in the previous leadership came from a place of not knowing. Are you confident now that the executive team understands the risks that remain in the project and that you have the skills to address this?
Stand by that, actually. I think the previous team were very experienced, but their lack of understanding of the work to do led to some decision making that wasn't optimal. So for me, I think we do understand how to complete this job. I do think we have the right skill set. There's no barrier, I don't think, to getting the right people on this job. So I would say yes, Keith. We've got a grip on this job, and we can see pretty clearly what's to do. Why do we have uncertainty? Well, we have uncertainty because as you're testing something or you're testing software, you find things that are wrong and you've got to fix them. And that's the guts of where our uncertainty lies. The process of testing reveals things that need to be fixed.
Well, I mean, it's fair to say, you know, and I accept what you said, Mark, and that's really reassuring. It's fair to say that you're trying to do something that's never been done in relation to the software. So, you know, just a quick one. Mr. Mayor, if I may, and credit's where it's due. First of all, congratulations on your anniversary last night. Thank you. And for going part of that and giving us a wonderful carol service. It was very enjoyable, thank you. And I thought your speech was good too, actually. No, well, sometimes it's questionable as to how partisan it is.
No, it's going to come in now, isn't it?
It was a very good speech.
I know it's Christmas.
Content was good. Delivery,
good will.
So Mike has quite generously told us he's spending around about 30% of his time on this project. I have no doubt in my mind that Heidi is giving a lot of her time to this project, hopefully a little bit to Gallows Corner, but a lot to this project. Mr. Mayor, I'd be interested to know what sort of percentage of time you think you're giving to this project.
I'll tell you, that's a lot of time, much more time than was in the previous regime. Not just face-to-face meetings, but reading stuff. Obviously, when Heidi and David and Mike meet with the team, I get debriefs and stuff, so there's a lot of time. On reference to the have we got the right expertise point, Keith, just to reassure you, not only have we got the best and the right expertise in the country, but we also ask, in a polite, courteous way, to contractors, whether it's Siemens or others, that we want your best from the world working on this, just to reassure you that we've got that reassurance. And one of the things, as part of the work I do in Crossrail, I check with Mark and Tony, is there anything I can do to help? Let me give you an example. So if, for example, I'll give you a hypothetical case, a tier 2 or tier 3 contractor is not doing what the team want, but we do business with them, other business, you know, I can simply pick up the phone and, or meet with them and say, listen, that's a priority for us. You've got these other contracts with us. The sensible thing to do would be to focus on that so we can get that finished. And so that's the sort of stuff where I rely upon Mark and Tony to let me know how more I can help, aside from the transport stuff as well.
But not in a bullying way, of course.
Always polite, always courteous, Keith.
Do you want to give me a percentage?
I couldn't. I mean, no? You know, I work 7 days a week, unlike the previous two holders. So I'm not really sure if my percentages are equivalent to the previous two mayors.
I do think, if I'm add,
there you go. All right, I'm not going to even. I'm not even going to rise to that.
something.
So, Mark,
Heidi wanted to just let Heidi on to your story.
I just wanted to add something about this sort of time question. I think it's the wrong way of looking at it, because I think it's what you do with the time that you're spending on it. And the only way I can characterise my engagement with people like Mark and Tony is that, and I think, you know, it characterises the Mayor's engagement as well, is that we're constantly impatient with them and we're permanently a little bit sceptical and challenging. And so actually, you know, this is what you're doing with the time, the questions that you're asking and how you're providing support to the team who've got a really difficult job to do. So I'm just not sure that that's exactly the way of looking at it.
It's only that Mike kindly offered a percentage, so I thought I'd go for it, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, Chair, so I won't rise to any debate that was put out earlier. So this is to Mark and to Tony, but really to you, Mark. I think you could probably just answer this one. In the monthly updates as late as October, you stated that you were still on track to meet the October 2020, March 21 deadline. When did you realise that this deadline would not be met, and what changed in the course of 1 month?
Well, we monitored demonstrated performance, as we've said before, you know, all of our KPIs and metrics, kind of an early warning system, you would say. So I would say we were really challenged around late September, early October. That's kind of when we were really quite challenged about the rate of testing, particularly in the stations, and the routeway assurance. And then, of course, work happens, validation. You try to mitigate, just to Tony's point. The reason for my job isn't just to let the slippage continue, it is to act. And I think that was kind of, it was obvious by September, October that our certain trends on assurance were going in slightly the wrong way compared to the construction, which was going in the right way, and the software was going in the right way. So it's kind of around that time, Keith, and then that's culminated in lots of extensive work and ended up with the announcement that we had.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, if I can just ask a question of you. When were you made aware of that situation changed?
We were concerned November the 7th. We were concerned in August, as I alluded to. There were some concerns that the Crossrail team had, but they, as Mark said, mitigations take place. In September, I attended the Crossrail board meeting, and the Crossrail team wanted to do further work, the testing that Mark's alluded to, and then I attended the Crossrail board meeting again on November the 7th. And that's when I was informed by the Crossrail team. They didn't think they'd do the first 3 months of the window, but to err on the side of caution, it was important for us, TfL, to let the markets know, for key Londoners to know as well. And one of the big lessons from last time was there to be maximum transparency. That's a tension because Mark wants to carry on applying the pressure to the contractors, the suppliers and others. So if you let them know there's slack, they will work to the slack, and so we need to be honest about the tension there is. But I'd far rather Londoners know there's a potential of us missing that window rather than the alternative what happened last time.
Yeah, I mean there is that risk of, as you sort of indicate, letting them off the hook, isn't there? Really, if you say, "Oh, it's not going to happen." But so you're saying, Mr. Mayor, that you had an indication around about August time that things weren't quite on track. I think no, sorry, it's not a question to you. I'm sorry. With respect. But Mark, you were saying in October that it was still on track.
No, in August there was some elements of the handover and the integration that we always needed more work to do.
Right.
By the time we got to late September, early October, we had evidence that we were struggling with it, but still mitigating. Very important on these jobs that you don't accept every single slippage. The management's job is to mitigate. But it was only really till the 7th of November, and I'm sure Tony would agree, we had our decision point was at that point, which is the culmination of a lot of scientific work to get to there. So we didn't really actually decide till the 7th of November.
Let me just add to that. I mean,
I'll accept that actually, Tony. That's what I do. I accept what Mark's saying.
So no need for me to cover.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap the next question up because I am conscious of time. Mark, obviously we're concerned about how the risk of the deadline being pushed back further will be mitigated. I think both you and Tony have given us a number of examples of where that will happen. So really the question I'd like you to just look at is, what lessons have you learnt from the risks that have caused the project to be delayed most recently? So the most recently, what lessons have you learnt from that?
Well, that's good. I mean, that's a good question, and we've factored in the rate of acceptance of these large stations, the rate that we can actually test, find more defects than we expected. We have actually found more defect at the bottom of our pyramid than we expected. So the real reason for the recalibration of our window is that we've taken all of our demonstrated performance in what we term the nursery, which were the first 5 stations, Victoria Dock Portal, Pudding Mill Lane, Custom House, Mine Shaft and Tottenham Court Road. And we did that deliberately, quite, I think, a smart move, that we took a small shaft and portal, then we built it up. And what we found in what we call the nursery, the learning ground, was probably at the much more adverse end than we would have expected. And there are many reasons for that, which probably take up another 2 hours. But it was really lessons out of the nursery, i.e. the learning zone, that we've now factored into the other 25 elements in Idioma. So the window we have now, and the reason actually we're confident this rail will open in 2021, it's based on our demonstrated performance that we hope to improve. So I think we've come a long, long way about understanding the trajectory of this project, what's left to do. It remains a very large challenge, but compared to this time last year when there wasn't actually a plan and nobody actually knew the volume to do, we now know the volume, and through what we call the nursery, the first 5 sites, we've got clear trajectory, and that's what's informing the window. The question for the board in January is, what does that mean, and what should the executive be challenged with?
Thank you, that's very helpful. Just a quick one, Tony, to do it offline really. You mentioned earlier about list of sponsors for the different stations. I'd be very interested to know who's sponsoring my 5 stations, especially Harrowwood and Ilford, but we'll do that offline. So thank you for all that. I think we now come to the Colombo moment, I think they call it. In the recommendations, we had recommendations 4 and 5, which we've covered about role as sponsors. But in recommendation 6, we talked about chief executive remuneration. And the recommendation 6 in the report was the remuneration packages for chief executives in large infrastructure projects should be benchmarked against those for other projects. Additionally, the process for setting and accessing performance bonuses should be revisited periodically to ensure the remuneration of programme chief executives adequately reflects progress towards the successful delivery of a publicly funded project. And our mayor, I believe, said that KPMG's independent reviews recommended that the sponsors and Crossrail should agree to changes to the procedures around remuneration of senior staff members. So my question to Mark and Mike and Tony is, what changes have been made to setting the remuneration packages? Tony,
can I start? I mean, we have constituted the remuneration committee, remuneration and nominations committee. Secondly, we have invited our sponsors to be a part of that committee so that they're fully apprised of and indeed engaged in any decisions made around that. Thirdly, we have set a bonus structure against our original DCS, and we are, that will be subject to external scrutiny before. So I think our remuneration policy is in very good shape.
So the changes you've made is to the people on the panel. You just said that, yeah. But I think the question is, what changes are you making to the packages, and when will we learn about that?
Well, what changes are we making to what? Sorry.
Changes you're making to the packages.
Well, no, the Mark's remuneration actually, for example, was set by TfL because Mark is a secondee from TfL. The bonus package is formulated by ourselves in Crossrail, and it is very reasonable. And furthermore, it's tied to actual performance, and it's tied to also to long-term performance, which I think is a difference from in the past.
You've made changes to the remuneration board, but not made any changes to the packages.
Well, I don't think we were asked to make changes from existing packages. I think these are references to historical events. Nobody has asked us.
The KPMG's report says sponsors and Crossrail should agree to changes to the procedures around remuneration of senior staff.
We have done that. We have done that by ensuring that we have invited the sponsors to attend our remuneration committee and be involved in any decisions around remuneration. So we've changed the processes. I'd have to say that so the levels of remuneration are quite, sorry to say this, Mark, but significantly less than they have been in the past, including myself, I might say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's the performance bonus element that I'm interested in what you just said, and I think the issue for us was that previous chief executives and others were able to take their bonus when they clearly weren't delivering the project.
Well, let me just be clear about
this. Do you want to clarify that element?
Let me be clear. We've got first of all, a very challenging set of performance metrics, which starts with safety, moves on to cost, and then hits 11 specific milestones, some of which are being hit, some of which I have to say are being missed as a result of our change to the schedule. And the second point is to say that the senior executive team bonuses will not be paid until not just at the end of this year when they are due, but until stage 3 is up and running.
Very good. That's very helpful and reassuring. Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for your time. It's been a long meeting, but it's very, very worthwhile for us going through where we were with our report and updates. Is there anything else any of you wanted to add, any particular things you're going to focus on in the next year, anything you wanted to add?
Just to re-offer, Chair, when the new Transport Committee reforms after the election, the team's very happy to come again to the Transport Committee to give this information, and other members of the Assembly are also more than welcome to come and ask questions.
Lovely. Well, I'm sure we'll make sure that is ready to move forward, and if some of us are lucky enough to be re-elected, it will be fresh in our mind. So thank you very much, Mike Brown, Heidi Alexander, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, Tony Meggs and Mark Wilde for your time this morning. We've got a few formal items to get through. Members, can we note the report and agree to delegate authority to myself in consultation with, well, no, it's not myself, the Chair, in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Group Leads to agree any output from today's meeting. I think there's a number of letters we thought we might want to send. Our work programme, item 7, can we note the work programme? Can we note the summary of the site visit to the Sarah Hope line? And can we agree to delegate authority to the Chair in consultation with the Deputy Chair and Party Group Lead members to agree any outputs from our investigation into the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf Bridge and our review on tram and bus safety, and also an output on London's transport now and in the future?
Agreed.
Thank you. Our next meeting will be on Wednesday the 8th of January at 10 o'clock in the morning in the Chamber, looking at accessible transport. And there's no other urgent business. Thank you very much indeed for your discipline, and Merry Christmas, members.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA Chamber Sound.